The sun beat down on the tarmac of New Orleans airport, but Carlos Marcello felt the cold grip of the law more than the heat. In a move that rattled the underworld and civil liberties advocates alike, the notorious New Orleans racketeer was whisked out of the country without warning. A vanishing act. But this time he wasn't pulling the strings. Marcello had arrived at the Immigration Service office for what was supposed to be his routine monthly check-in, a ritual he had performed without incident for 5 years. But this time, the air felt different, charged, hostile. His Washington attorney, Jack Wasserman, would later call it Gestapo tactics, a sudden, brutal enforcement of immigration law that reeked of injustice. Inside the office, the mood was ice cold. When Marcello asked to see his lawyer, Philip Smith, he was met with a stone wall. Smith, waiting outside, was corralled into an Immigration Service car. No phone call, no explanation. With siren screaming, the convoy raced to the airport. Smith trapped inside, his rights shredded along with his patience. By the time the car skidded to a halt near the plane, Marcello was already on the ramp, handcuffed, stripped of dignity and due process. Smith, finally released from the vehicle, sprinted for a telephone, too late. The plane, with its solitary passenger and 3 silent officials, had already roared into the sky, bound for Guatemala. Attorney General Robert Kennedy, cold and clinical, insisted that the deportation had been in strict accordance with the law. But Jack Wasserman wasn't buying it. The American Civil Liberties Union joined the chorus of protest, blasting the lawless enforcement that had shocked even seasoned legal observers. But the ink on the deportation order was dry. Marcello, who had battled deportation for a decade, found himself alone in a foreign landowner, wife, no children, not even a change of clothes. The Guatemalan authorities had accepted him, pointing to a birth record that claimed him as one of their own. But Marcello, in his defiant Louisiana drawl, dismissed it as a lie. He had always maintained his birthplace was Tunis, brandishing a baptismal record for a Calogero Minacori as proof. Yet Guatemala, fueled by its own records for a Coljas Minacor, born on the same date, shut its doors behind him. But Carlos Marcello wasn't one to be caged. The news broke like a thunderclap. Carlos Marcello had vanished. The Guatemalan police, primed and waiting at the Guatemala City airport, were left grasping at air. Somehow, in the chaos of his arrival, Marcello had slipped through their net. No chains, no cuffs, just gone. For hours, he became a ghost in a country he never claimed as his own. It wasn't until a crackling radio bulletin late that night that the mystery unraveled. Marcello had been found and taken into custody. But how he had melted into the city streets before being apprehended remained a question unanswered. The echoes of Marcello's ordeal reverberated back to the United States, where the Santa Barbara news press recounted his ordeal in sharp detail. Contacted through an overseas line from his Guatemalan hotel room, Marcello's voice carried the unmistakable grit of his Louisiana roots, tinged with bitter outrage. "They had the plane already started when we arrived," he spat. His arrest, he claimed, was a textbook ambush. The notice that Guatemala had accepted him hit him like a blow. No warning, no hearing, no mercy. His lawyer, Philip Smith, had tried to intervene, but the immigration officers were as cold as the steel that had clicked around Marcello's wrists. "I asked for some clothes," Marcello recalled, his voice growling low. "It's on the way to the airport," they told him. They lied. "They wouldn't even talk to me," he said. Except for one gesture, hollow in its irony. "One guy offered me a cup of coffee." The plane that ferried him to Exile was cavernous and cold. Aside from 3 tight-lipped immigration officers, he was alone, a solitary passenger on a one-way trip. Upon landing, the custody of his person transferred from the United States to a man as enigmatic as the fate awaiting him. Colonel Antonio Batres, second in command of the Guatemalan Air Force. With barely a word, Marcello was handed over, and the American plane, emptied of its notorious cargo, lifted off, returning to the skies it had carved through hours before. Back in Washington, another storm brewed. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy claimed ignorance of the operation, an omission Marcello would never believe. But the finger of blame turned elsewhere, to Immigration Commissioner Joseph Swing, the man Marcello accused of orchestrating his sudden expulsion. The headlines screamed of scandal, civil liberties organizations cried foul. But for Carlos Marcello, stranded in a hostile land, it wasn't about politics or pressure. It was survival. The game had changed, but the rules remained the same. The United States had tossed him to the wolves, but it was Guatemala that would decide whether he walked away free, hunted, or buried. The clock was ticking, and the underworld was watching. The walls were closing in, but Carlos Marcello wasn't going down quietly. His sudden exile to Guatemala had unleashed a firestorm back in the States. Headlines screamed, lawyers scrambled, and accusations flew like bullets. The Oregon Daily Journal took its readers back to the beginning, to a time before the Kefauver hearings, before the television cameras, and the courtroom theatrics. October 12th, 1950. That was when this columnist first unmasked Marcello as a kingpin in the Mafia's southern empire, a man whose reach extended from the drug trade to the political backrooms of Jefferson Parish. They had kept on him through the years, 1952, 1954, 1955, 1959, each expose another brushstroke in the portrait of a man who seemed untouchable. But no one was untouchable, not forever. The columnist painted the scene as Marcello himself had recounted it, his Louisiana drawl dripping with disdain. He had arrived at the immigration office for what was supposed to be routine monthly check-in, same as always. But this time, there was no routine, only chaos. The news hit like a hammer. Guatemala had accepted him. Marcello exploded. He wasn't from Guatemala, and he damn well wasn't leaving without a fight. He demanded to see his lawyer, Philip Smith, who had come with him that morning. Smith was allowed to ride with him, to the airport, but not beyond. Sealed inside a car with the doors locked, he could only watch as his client was hustled across the tarmac, cuffed and voiceless. "I'd like to get some clothes," Marcello had asked, his voice edged with sarcasm and rage. "It's on the way to the airport," they lied. The plane was already growling on the runway, engines hot and ready. Smith, freed from the car, sprinted for a phone, his heart pounding with urgency. But by the time he heard the dial tone, it was over. The plane, Marcello's prison in the sky, had vanished into the clouds. The fallout came swift and sharp. The Daily News minced no words in its editorial, cutting through the national uproar like a blade. Marcello was no victim. He was a plague. His deportation was long overdue, the paper roared, and the real scandal was that it hadn't happened sooner. Yet even as the editorial eviscerated Marcello's criminal past, it couldn't ignore the stench of the operation that had taken him down. "This is not a Gestapo state," it warned. "Force is not the correct procedure." Still, Marcello remained defiant. From his temporary cage in Guatemala, he projected confidence, cocky even, that he'd be back on American soil soon enough. But the Daily News had a warning for Attorney General Robert Kennedy. If Marcello returns, finish the job, legally, publicly, and with the full force of the law. But Washington wasn't waiting for his return to start tearing him down. That same day, the Daily World delivered a financial gut punch. The federal government had filed fresh tax liens against Marcello, this time in 4 more Louisiana parishes: Cadeau, Calcasieu, Saint Charles, and Bossier. Chester Usry, the district director of Internal Revenue, was clinical. Marcello's sudden, unpermitted departure triggered the presumption that Uncle Sam might never see the taxes owed, $835,396 in all. The liens stacked atop earlier filings in Orleans, Jefferson and St. Bernard parishes were a financial bear trap, snapping shut on every asset Marcello had left behind. Carlos Marcello's fury was volcanic rage born not just from exile, but from disrespect. This wasn't business. This was personal. The April 4th deportation wasn't just a removal. It was a kidnapping, a hit job ordered from the top, carried out in the shadows. Robert Kennedy, in his crusade against organized crime, thought he had struck a mighty blow. But what he didn't know, what he could never have imagined, was that the man he had just made his enemy wasn't just a mob boss. From the shadows of the post-war underworld, Marcello had built more than an empire of vice. He had built an alliance with the silent hand of American power. Since the dawn of the CIA, his reach into the smuggling routes, gambling operations, and political fixers had been more than profit. It had been patriotism for a price. He was a man the agency could rely on when they needed dirty work done in clean hands. But Kennedy didn't stop at Carlos. While Marcello fought from the shadows of exile, the administration came for his family. Tax liens, brutal, crippling, were slapped against his wife, Jacqueline. In the world of men like Carlos Marcello, you didn't touch the family. To Marcello, it wasn't law. It was disrespect. It was a declaration of war. In one swift stroke, Robert Kennedy had crossed a line no federal agent, no prosecutor, no president had ever dared cross. He had made it personal. But Robert Kennedy had made one fatal mistake. He thought Carlos Marcello was out of the fight. But Carlos Marcello was never just a man. He was a system. His power didn't end with his absence. It grew in the shadows. And from the shadows, he would wage a different kind of war. Not one fought with guns, but with connections, with alliances, with enemies of his enemy. Marcello understood power. He didn't need to face Robert Kennedy directly. He needed to remove the man who protected him, the president. Because Carlos Marcello, from the day he was thrown into the wind, carried one thought in his gut: a dog will continue to bite you if you only cut off its tail. But if you want to stop the dog, you cut off its head. But in Guatemala, the lion roared. The Tyler Morning Telegraph relayed Marcello's first public words from exile, and they dripped with fury. I was kidnapped from the United States. No debate, no grey area, just a charge hurled like a grenade. When pressed for details, Marcello, ever the tactician, clammed up. Call me next week, he said. But the promise in his voice hinted at something coming. A move, a break, a crack in the walls closing around him. The Guatemalan press, however, was less coy. El Imparcial claimed that the Interior Ministry had obtained a damning document, a Guatemalan birth. Registration for Colodge's Minocor, Marcello's supposed alias, dating back to 1956. The paper fanned the flames, whispering that Marcello had already dipped his fingers into Guatemala's underworld, possibly connected to an illegal gambling ring. Meanwhile, the Guatemalan government, smelling the heat from Washington, played it cool. The Danville Register and B, through a dispatch from the New Orleans States item, reported that Augusto Muley, the presidential press secretary, had taken a firm public stance. The records were legal, the deportation justified, and there would be no investigation into allegations of forgery. We have nothing against this man, Muley declared. No official complaint has been filed, and he is charged with nothing. But the Guatemalan press wasn't buying it. They slammed the birth certificate as a blatant forgery, a fiction crafted to shuffle Washington's problem into their backyard. Marcello, in his sweet-turned bunker, denied knowing anything about the documents or how they appeared. But the defiance in his voice was sharp. I was born in Tunis, and I'll die with that truth. The battle lines are drawn. In less than a week, Carlos Marcello had gone from kingpin to captive, from power to prey. Washington was stripping his empire to the bone, his money frozen, his property under siege. The newspapers debated his guilt. Guatemala debated his citizenship. But Carlos Marcello, alone, enraged and calculating, wasn't debating anything. He was planning. The sharks were circling, but they had made one mistake. They had left him breathing. The Guatemalan government, sensing the heat from Washington, chose a familiar refuge: neutrality. In a dispatch from Guatemala City, reporter Emile Comar of the New Orleans States item relayed the official line: calm, cold, and calculated. The records are legal, declared Augusto Muley, the presidential press secretary. We have nothing against this man. No official complaint has been filed, and he is charged with nothing. The message was clear. Guatemala wasn't going to be Washington's dumping ground without a fight. But the Guatemalan press, less bound by diplomacy, smelled something rotten. They blasted Marcello's birth certificate from San Jose Pinula as a forgery, a crude attempt to launder the deportation through paperwork. Marcello, lounging in luxury under the watchful eye of Guatemalan police, played to the cameras with his usual defiance. The documents are forgeries, he insisted, his voice dripping with contempt. I was born in Tunis, and I'll die saying it. He denied any knowledge of who had conjured the phony birth record. But he wasn't fooled. This was a game, and someone had dealt him a loaded hand. In the background, his legal artillery was assembling. Jack Wasserman, his chief legal advisor, was en route from Washington with one mission: tear down the deportation in U.S. District Court and bring his client home. But the cracks in the facade were already showing. Jose Palmieri, a Guatemalan journalist visiting New Orleans, dropped a bombshell: collusion. He told reporters that whispers back home pointed to a deal. Marcello, working hand in glove with a high-ranking Guatemalan official, had greased the wheels for his supposed citizenship. Guatemalans are shocked, Palmieri said, his voice sharp with indignation. This man is getting the red carpet treatment, free run of the country, while ordinary travelers face restrictions. If Marcello had greased the right palms, it would explain a lot. The forged birth record, the official silence, the sudden hospitality. But it also meant something worse. Washington's problem had just become Guatemala's, and the backlash was building. Back in the States, the Detroit Free Press took aim at the chorus of outrage from civil liberties groups, especially the American Civil Liberties Union, which had condemned Marcello's deportation as totalitarian tactics. The editorial, laced with scorn, pulled no punches. Where does this leave the ACLU? Out in left field. The paper reminded its readers of who Marcello was: a convicted drug trafficker, a syndicate boss who had spent 9 years playing legal hopscotch to dodge deportation. Italy had refused him. Tunisia had denied him. So when Guatemala opened its doors, the immigration service shoved him through. And rightly so, the editorial argued. Yet even in their disdain for Marcello, the editors acknowledged one brutal truth: the operation had been a hatchet job. Marcello's deportation lacked only the proper dumping ground to provide a satisfactory conclusion, they wrote. And that dumping ground, whether forged, bought, or coerced, was Guatemala. But in Guatemala, the air was thick with uncertainty. The Quad City Times relayed Marcello's latest move, or lack thereof. He was waiting on word from his legal team, waiting on a miracle from the courts. I have no plans, he told reporters, his voice flat, but his eyes calculating. Not until I hear from my lawyers. The walls were closing, but Marcello wasn't moving, not until the game played out. The Ranger Review, retracing the chaos, painted a picture of a man swept up in a storm he couldn't control, but wouldn't surrender to. From the frantic sprint to the plane in New Orleans, to the tense hours in Guatemala City, every move had been a play for control. Marcello's voice, captured from his hotel, was raw with defiance. "They told me I am a Guatemalan citizen and can do what I want," he barked over the phone. But his version of events cut through the chaos. The car ride with his lawyer trapped beside him, the plane roaring on the runway, the refusal of his simple request. "I would like to get some clothes." And the eerie silence from his captors. Only one gesture from his captors stood out, hollow and mocking. "One guy offered me a cup of coffee," he sneered. And then the landing, cold and hostile. Colonel Antonio Batres of the Guatemalan Air Force awaited him, a ghostly figure from a regime entangled in shadowy alliances with the CIA. Batres didn't explain. He didn't need to. He simply whisked Marcello away to a private apartment, leaving Guatemalan immigration officers cooling their heels at the wrong airport. The next day, a knock at the door. It wasn't the police. It wasn't the press. It was his brother's family, who had scoured the city desperately to find him. But in the privacy of that room, the truth slipped from Marcello's lips. A name, a target for his rage. Joseph Swing. "Swing did this," Marcello snapped. "He did the same thing to me before. It's him, not Kennedy. Swing's just trying to show the Attorney General what he can do." The grudge ran deep. Joseph Swing, the immigration commissioner, had tangled with Marcello years earlier, and now, without warning, without mercy, he had struck again. The tide turns. In just 2 weeks, Carlos Marcello had been seized, exiled, and stripped bare of his empire. But through the smoke and chaos, he remained what he always had been, a fighter. The walls around him were closing, but he wasn't trapped. He was waiting. Because Marcello knew something the law didn't. A man like him never stays buried for long. The backlash was boiling over. In the heart of Jefferson Parish, Marcello's own backyard, the Jefferson News delivered a scorching editorial, not in defense of the man, but of the law. No one, it declared, was shedding tears for Carlos Marcello. He was a gangster, a racketeer, a man who brought rot to every corner he touched. But the stain of his deportation, swift and lawless, was darker than the man himself. "They hustled him to Guatemala without a toothbrush, without a goodbye to his wife," the editorial thundered. Not a moment to contest the evidence of his so-called citizenship. The paper turned to the Fifth Amendment, the cornerstone of justice, which promised that no person, not citizen person, should be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process. Marcello may have been a blight, but blights have rights. "This is America," it warned. "Not Nazi Germany, not Soviet Russia, not Castro's Cuba." And in a chilling prophecy, the editorial closed with a warning that should haunt every reader. If the government can do this to one man, they can do it to any. But in Guatemala, the winds were shifting, and they were cold. The Ledger Star delivered the shockwave, an arrest order. Guatemala's courts had ruled. The birth certificate that supposedly made Marcello a native son was a lie. The investigation had been swift and damning, and now Marcello was a fugitive, a man with nowhere to run. By the next day, the gavel came down. The Kansas City Times reported that Marcello was in custody, his freedom shattered by the very country he was supposed to call home. The court's investigation had gutted his claim of citizenship. The certificate claimed that Caljas Minacor Farrugia, alias Carlos Marcello, was born in San Jose Pinula on February 6, 1910. The civil registry? Empty. No such birth had ever been recorded. The so-called certified copy from 1956. A Hamisit-Vani. The trapdoor had opened beneath him. The evening star painted the scene in cold strokes. Carlos Marcello, the boss of Jefferson Parish, the kingpin of the Louisiana rackets, reduced to a caged man, cooling his heels in police headquarters, facing a weekend behind bars. His lawyer arrived but left with no promises. Bail? Maybe. A quick release? Don't count on it. Marcello's fate now hung between two courts, Guatemala's, where his arrest was certain, and Washington's, where a three-judge panel was about to decide if his deportation had been a crime in itself. Monday brought no reprieve. The Vicksburg Post reported that Marcello faced a hearing on charges of falsifying his birth records, a trial for a lie he claimed he never told. He clung to the same line, the same defense. I was born in Tunis. I belong in New Orleans. But the Guatemalan court had no interest in his past, only in his papers. And those papers were poison. Then the story turned mad. The Bee broke the news. President Miguel Ydígoras Fuentes himself had intervened, not to arrest Marcello, but to arrest the man who freed him. Ranulfo González Ovalle, the chief of Guatemala's Special Investigation Department, had gone rogue. Defying orders, he had cut Marcello loose without consulting his superiors. When the president's men came to arrest him, González didn't run. He barricaded himself in his office, gun drawn, grenade in hand. The building swarmed with police, but González dared them to try. He had freed Marcello, and he was willing to die with that decision. By the time the dust settled, Marcello was gone. The Evening Star delivered the latest shock. The kingpin had slipped out of his hotel without a trace. The police searched. His lawyer stammered. The only trace, a re-entry permit, seized from his belongings, a last flimsy tie to a country that now wanted him out as badly as the one he had left behind. But where could he run? The United States wouldn't have him. Guatemala was trying to bury him, and no other nation wanted to touch him. Nowhere man. In just over 3 weeks, Carlos Marcello had gone from crime lord to deportee to fugitive. Washington had cast him out. Guatemala had caged him. And now he was a shadow, a man with no country. But Carlos Marcello was more than a man. He was a survivor. And survivors don't disappear. They come back, and they come back angry. Carlos Marcello was on the move again, but this time not as a fugitive. According to the Ledger Star, he had slipped into the Guatemalan interior, not to run, but to buy. A farm, of all things. A quiet patch of land, far from the chaos. But the ground beneath his feet was already cracking. While Marcello eyed property, his wife, Jacqueline, went to war. She filed a desperate petition with Guatemala's Supreme Court, pleading for an injunction to block her husband's deportation. The court, wary but willing, gave President Ydígoras 24 hours to explain why he was so determined to expel Marcello. The man Guatemala had first welcomed as a native son was now a political hand grenade. The Americans had hurled him south, and now Guatemala was ready to throw him anywhere but here. The counterattack came swiftly, from Marcello's lawyer, Michel Maroon, who summoned the press to a conference crackling with defiance. Maroon announced a bold new front, a direct appeal to the most powerful brothers in America, President John F. Kennedy and Attorney General Robert Kennedy. Authorize his return, Maroon demanded, because what was done to him was kidnapping, pure and simple. But Maroon wasn't finished. He promised a legal war on 2 fronts. A lawsuit against the U.S. Immigration Commissioner and Attorney General Kennedy himself for violating Marcello's civil rights. Libel suits against any American newspaper that dared call his client King of the Underworld, or racketeer, again. And as for the so-called crime that had sparked his exile, Maroon spat at it. A marijuana conviction from 1938, he scoffed. A debt paid long ago. He painted Marcello as a reformed businessman, pursued not for his sins, but for his power. But the winds of outrage had reached far beyond Guatemala. The Missoulian, quoting from the New York Times, seethed with condemnation. not for Marcello, but for the United States government. The editorial laid it out bare and brutal. Marcello had reported to the immigration office, as he had for years. He was handcuffed without warning. No lawyer, no phone call, no clothes, no goodbye to his family. And while he was being dragged to the plane, television crews, tipped off in advance, filmed the spectacle like a prize fight. It was a show, the paper thundered. A public humiliation, wrapped in the American flag. Senator Sam Ervin of North Carolina, no friend to criminals, called it a disgrace. "If the reports are true," he said coldly, "it's a denial of justice." Attorney General Robert Kennedy, now caught in the backlash, tried to distance himself. "I would have used different steps," he said, but the Missoulian wasn't buying his shrug. "The Immigration Service is under your charge, Mr. Kennedy, and you cannot escape responsibility." Then came the warning, cold and clear as a grave marker. The test of any government is how it treats even the most reprehensible person. For history shows that mistreatment of Carlos Marcello is a threat to the rights of everyone. The pressure mounts. So there it stood. Carlos Marcello, on the run, but unbroken. His enemies had power, but he had patience. His name was Mud, but he still had the law. In Washington, Robert Kennedy was sweating under the glare of scandal. In Guatemala, President Idígoras was trapped between an unwanted guest and a courtroom showdown. And in the shadows, Carlos Marcello waited, knowing something they had all forgotten. A man with nothing to lose is the most dangerous man alive. The skies above the Caribbean roared with chaos. An American airliner, bound for Key West, had been hijacked, its pilot held at gunpoint, its passengers frozen in fear. The man behind it? A self-proclaimed pirate, calling himself El Pirata Cofresi, after the legendary Caribbean buccaneer. But this wasn't just another act of madness. This was a message. The hijacker, a wiry figure in dark glasses, made his motives clear. Dominican Republic strongman Rafael Trujillo, a man deeply tied to the same underworld web that sheltered men like Carlos Marcello, had offered him $100,000 to assassinate Fidel Castro. But the pirate wasn't here to kill. He was here to warn. He was flying to Havana to spill the beans directly to Castro himself. With a blade at the pilot's throat and a silver pistol glinting in the cockpit, he hissed, "If I don't see Havana in 30 minutes, we all die." The pilot, Captain Francis Riley, zigzagged the plane over Key West in a desperate signal for help. None came. In Havana, the response was cold. Air traffic control ordered the plane to turn back, or be shot down. Desperate, Riley bluffed, claiming he was out of fuel. Finally, the Cubans relented, directing them to San Antonio Air Force Base. When they landed, Castro's soldiers swarmed the tarmac. But they didn't greet Cofresi as a hero. They dragged him into custody. "I'm sorry to have inconvenienced you," the pirate told the pilot, his voice almost apologetic, before he vanished into the Cuban night. The secret war and the dominoes falling. But behind the headlines, a darker game was unfolding. Trujillo, the Dominican dictator, wasn't offering hits on Castro out of loyalty to America. He was a friend to the Mafia, a protector of their Caribbean interests after Castro had ripped Cuba from their hands. He was a man who understood that what was bad for Castro was good for the mob, and his loyalty ran deep. When Carlos Marcello found himself exiled in Guatemala, it was Trujillo who would become the key to his return to American soil, a secret favor from one crime king to another. But Trujillo's friendship with the Mafia had made him an enemy to a more dangerous power, Robert Kennedy. To Kennedy, Trujillo wasn't just a dictator. He was a pipeline between organized crime and anti-Castro mercenaries. A man feeding the very machine of lawlessness the Kennedys sought to dismantle. And so, Robert Kennedy ordered his death. But what the Attorney General didn't know What would send shockwaves through the underworld was that when Trujillo helped smuggle Carlos Marcello back into the United States, he was already a marked man. When Trujillo was assassinated, Marcello soon learned the bitter truth, from none other than his ally, Santo Traficante. It wasn't just a coup. It was a hit authorized by the same man chasing him. Robert Kennedy wasn't just coming for Marcello's empire, he was coming for everyone around him. Back in Guatemala, the noose was tightening. Guatemala, now trapped in the same nightmare America had lived through for a decade, had a problem. No one wanted Carlos Marcello. Arturo Aguirre Mateo, Guatemala's immigration chief, made it plain. "We cannot deport him," he said, exasperated. "He has no papers and no country will accept him." The United States had tried for years. Italy said no. France said no. Canada, Mexico, no. Even Italy's brief acceptance had been reversed for political reasons. The man was toxic. The only thing more impossible than keeping him was getting rid of him. But Guatemala had made its choice. Carlos Marcello would be deported. The order was final. His entire family, including his wife Jacqueline, was told to leave the country by the next afternoon. But to where? No one knew. No nation wanted him. No border would take him. And yet, Marcello, for all his power and cunning, refused to panic. Because he knew something that Washington and Guatemala did not. He was already working his way back. The war behind the headlines. So there it was. Trujillo, the Dominican dictator and mafia ally, assassinated on Kennedy's orders. Carlos Marcello hunted, exiled and despised, but never defeated. And in the shadows, a mafia awakening. The Kennedys weren't just fighting organized crime. They were fighting a war. A war where enemies were toppled not by courts, but by bullets. And Carlos Marcello, watching his allies fall, finally understood. Kennedy wasn't stopping. Not until they were all dead. But if Kennedy thought Marcello would go quietly, he was dead wrong. In New Orleans, the press swarmed, hungry for answers. But Vincent Marcello, younger brother to the infamous Carlos, became a ghost. After promising to reveal the whole situation behind his brother's chaotic deportation, he vanished, first delaying, then slipping away during lunch, leaving reporters chasing shadows. The Marcello women, however, had beaten their deadline. Jacqueline Marcello, Carlos's wife, and their 17-year-old daughter Florence boarded a plane out of Guatemala with Vincent's wife. By 1:20 in the afternoon, they were safely on their way back to New Orleans, 40 minutes ahead of Guatemala's expulsion deadline. But their departure only widened the mystery. The one question every reporter screamed, "Where would Carlos go?" remained unanswered. Back in Guatemala, Carlos Marcello's world collapsed further. The official order came down. Deportation, immediately, and absolute. The message, cold and curt, was delivered by a court officer at his hotel. His family was already gone. His home was stripped from him, and worst of all, no destination was named. Carlos Marcello, the man America didn't want, was now a problem for a nation that wanted nothing to do with him. Then, he disappeared. On Wednesday night, at around 9 p.m., police escorted Carlos Marcello from the Biltmore Hotel in Guatemala City. By Thursday morning, he was gone. Hotel staff hadn't seen him. The police refused to talk. But the chaos spread far beyond his hotel room. In an astonishing move, the Guatemalan government ordered TACA Airlines to suspend all operations in Guatemala. Pan American World Airways to halt all Guatemala to Miami flights. The entire air corridor between Guatemala and the United States was shut down, trapping hundreds of travelers and throwing airline schedules into disarray. The reason? No airline would accept Carlos Marcello as a passenger. The fallout hit hard. a Baton Rouge businessman, trapped in the chaos, described the scene. 240 passengers stranded, 6 hours, grounded because nobody wanted Carlos on their plane. Phones in Washington burned with calls from furious Americans demanding the flight ban be lifted. Diplomats scrambled. Only after hours of frantic back-channel negotiations did flights resume. But Marcello wasn't on any of them. Then came the final twist, an ending worthy of a farce. Unconfirmed reports surfaced. Carlos Marcello had tried to flee to El Salvador, but even there, the answer was the same. No. Salvadoran authorities refused him entry and turned him back, and so he returned to Guatemala. The man nobody wanted. Carlos Marcello, crime lord, racketeer, power broker, was now a man without a country. The United States threw him out. Guatemala disowned him. El Salvador rejected him, and the airlines refused to carry him. He was trapped in a diplomatic no-man's land, exiled, excommunicated, but not eliminated. But if they thought he was beaten, they didn't know Carlos Marcello. Because a man with nowhere left to go will fight to take everything back. The manhunt for Carlos Marcello had become a spectacle of confusion and chaos. The trail went cold on Wednesday night, the moment he was escorted from his hotel by Guatemalan police. His wife, Jacqueline, his daughter Florence, and his brother Vincent had already fled back to New Orleans, where Vincent offered reporters everything, then nothing. He was refused a ticket back to Louisiana, Vincent muttered to the press. But where was Carlos now? He wouldn't say. Then came the crossfire of accusations. Interior Minister Rodolfo Martinez Sobral claimed that Marcello had been dumped at the Salvadoran border. El Salvador shot back, saying they had thrown him right back into Guatemala. Guatemalan police insisted they had no record of his return. Whispers from nearby towns placed Marcello somewhere outside Guatemala City. But when asked directly, several Americans last seen with him responded with a choir of shrugs. We know nothing. The skies, too, had been locked down. Guatemala froze all outbound flights, paralyzing air travel. Reports of an uprising trickled through the panic, but the government denied it. The real reason for the chaos? Carlos Marcello. In Washington, immigration agents inspected every flight arriving from Guatemala to Houston. Not a trace. Marcello hadn't slipped back into the States, yet. The official stance from Guatemala was ironclad. Marcello must go. His family must go. But where? Guatemala insisted he was not entitled to remain. The birth certificate that got him here was forged. But without a destination, Guatemala held the same losing hand the United States once did. A prisoner they could not keep and could not cast away. The skies stayed silent. Guatemala struck back at the airlines that defied them. Pan American Airways, PAA, barred. No flights in, no flights out. The reason? Though unspoken, it was clear. PAA had refused to fly Carlos Marcello back to the United States. The United States didn't want him. The airlines wouldn't take him. And now Guatemala decided no one was flying until someone took Carlos Marcello. And then, a sudden twist. The court ordered his rearrest. Guatemala's appeals court had reversed an earlier ruling and demanded Marcello's capture immediately. The charge, fraudulent use of a false birth certificate. But the police, now chasing a ghost, came up empty. They claimed Marcello had been sent to the Salvadoran border on May 3rd and crossed into El Salvador. El Salvador denied it and insisted he was back in Guatemala. So where was he? The border towns buzzed with rumors. Marcello was hiding somewhere in the shadows between nations, a man without papers, without a country, but far from powerless. The battle for the skies. Meanwhile, Guatemala kept the pressure on the airways. Pan-American flights. Still banned, Guatemala accused PAA of defying their will. TACA Airlines? Ban lifted, but only after they buckled under pressure and denied Marcello a seat. Guatemalan officials claimed the flight bans were about air route rights, but no one believed it. The skies had become another battlefield in the war over Carlos Marcello. The noose tightens, the shadow slips. Carlos Marcello had become more than a man. He was now a diplomatic crisis, a headline war, and a manhunt without borders. America wanted him gone, but nowhere near its soil. Guatemala wanted him gone, but where? El Salvador wouldn't take him. The skies wouldn't carry him. But Carlos Marcello was still out there, waiting, plotting, moving in the shadows. And the world was about to learn. A man with nowhere to land can still make the whole world crash. The name Carlos Marcello had become more than a headline. It was a metaphor. The St. Tammany farmer, with biting sarcasm, compared the crime lord's fate to a problem as old as civilization itself. Garbage. Everyone has garbage, the editorial quipped. Nobody wants it, nobody wants to see it, but everyone wants it gone, far away. And in this twisted parable, Carlos Marcello had become the world's trash. The problem was that no one wanted his garbage dumped on their doorstep. But in Guatemala, the hunt continued. The government, humiliated and exhausted, admitted that they were still searching for Carlos Marcello. The man had vanished like smoke, and their best efforts had turned up nothing. However, the skies reopened. After weeks of strained relations, Guatemala announced that Pan American Airways could resume flights between Guatemala and Miami. The airline's punishment had ended, because they had refused to carry Marcello back to the United States 2 weeks earlier. The problem remained, though. The man himself, gone. The mystery deepened. In a courtroom in Washington, Carlos Marcello's lawyer, Michael Maroon, dropped a bombshell under oath. Marcello had not simply disappeared. He had been deported at gunpoint from Guatemala, a brutal expulsion without due process. He had spent 4 days in an El Salvador jail, caged like a common criminal. But when asked the question, the world was screaming, "Where is he now?" Maroon refused to answer. The same revelation echoed across headlines. Where is Carlos Marcello? Maroon's testimony had shifted the story from search to cover-up. Guatemala had claimed he fled. El Salvador had claimed he never entered. Now, under oath, his lawyer claimed both were lying. Carlos Marcello, master of the shadows, was still hiding. But where? Then came the hammer blow. In Washington, U.S. District Judge Alexander Holtzoff delivered a decision that crushed Marcello's last legal lifeline. The deportation to Guatemala on April 4th was ruled valid and legal. The judge sided with the government. Once Guatemala had accepted Marcello, the matter was closed. Carlos Marcello had no right to return to the United States. Marcello's attorneys, led by the legendary Jack Wasserman, responded immediately with a vow, "We will appeal, of course." But the ruling carried a chilling finality. It sealed Marcello's fate. He was stateless, homeless, and outlawed. A man without a country. In just over a month, Carlos Marcello had gone from New Orleans' undisputed kingpin to a fugitive smuggled out at gunpoint, to a ghost with no nation willing to claim him. The United States had thrown him out. Guatemala had rejected him. El Salvador had caged and expelled him, and the court had sealed the door behind him. Carlos Marcello and Mike Maroon were staying at the Biltmore Hotel, and that's when it got strange. 2 Secret Service guys were parked on them. By 8 that night, 3 more walked in. No warnings, no explanations. Just, pack your bags. Carlos and Mike barely had time to grab their things before they were shoved into a station wagon. They thought they were going back to the airport. They weren't. The car rolled through the night and crossed the border, not into the US, not even into Mexico, but into El Salvador. Not the city, the jungle. They stopped at some army camp out in the middle of nowhere, and suddenly Carlos and Mike were at the mercy of Salvadoran soldiers. The camp commander took their $3,000, made them sign it over for safekeeping. 6 days they kept them locked up, interrogated them, humiliated them. Then, at 11 o'clock one night, an officer stepped into their cell. "Get ready, Mr. Marcello. We're taking you to Honduras." Carlos tried to slow the clock. "Wait for daylight," he said. But the officer wasn't having it. "No. Orders are orders. You're going now." At least they gave him back the $3,000, but Carlos knew what was coming next. 2 guards, just for him and Mike. An escort, they called it. Carlos called it something else. A setup. They stuffed their money into their shoes. Every dollar. Then the guards crammed them onto a beat-up old bus that started climbing into the mountains. For 6 hours, the engine coughed and wheezed up a pitted, narrow road through the jungle. And then, without ceremony, without a word, they stopped. The guards tossed them off the bus like trash. Just a dirt road and the trees. No houses, no signs. Nothing. The bus rumbled away, leaving Carlos and Mike in the dust, alone. There was no choice. They started walking, and it was hell. 8 hours, 17 miles, no food, no water, just the heat and the road and the weight of the jungle pressing down on them. Carlos, built for the lowlands of Louisiana, couldn't breathe in that thin mountain air. He collapsed, once, twice, face down in the dirt. By the 3rd time, he was spitting his last breath into the dust. And all he could think of was Bobby Kennedy, that rich kid who'd thrown him into this nightmare. He told Mike, "If I don't make it, if this is it, you tell my brothers what that kid Bobby done to us. You tell 'em, do what they gotta do." But Carlos wasn't the type to stay down. He dragged himself to his feet and kept going. And finally, they stumbled into a village. The people fed them, let them rest. But rest wasn't the end of it. They hired 2 Indian boys, guides, to lead them to the nearest airstrip. But halfway down the trail, something shifted again. Carlos saw it in their eyes, the whispers, the glances. Suddenly those machetes didn't look like tools. They looked like weapons. And Carlos, ribs screaming, body broken, knew exactly what was coming. So, he made the move. He and Mike slowed, dropped back, then disappeared, plunging off the path into the underbrush. The jungle tore at them, thorns slicing their skin, rocks battering their knees. Somewhere in the fall, Carlos felt something crack. Later, he'd find out. 3 ribs, broken. But they lost the boys, and they lived. Hours more, pushing through the brush, until finally they stumbled into a provincial airstrip. They didn't think. They paid whatever it took for a plane, anything, just to get to Tegucigalpa, the Honduran capital. When they landed, they hit a hotel and crashed. 2 days of sleep. Out cold. Mike went back to the States to let the family know Carlos was alive. Beaten, but alive. And Carlos? He laid low for 2 weeks, but not forever. He wasn't staying in Honduras. He was going home. Somehow, because this was Carlos Marcello, he got a forged visa and a ticket to Miami. And, on the morning of that flight, he played it at old school. He went to 9 churches, lit a candle in each one, left a couple dollars in every collection plate. Then he went to the airport, got on the plane, and landed in Miami. Immigration searched for him. Customs searched for him. But those papers are perfect. He walked right through, right out the door. And he didn't stop. He got into a cab and told the driver, "New Orleans. Take me home. Go around back." When he walked through the door, his wife nearly screamed. "Carlos," she said, "immigration's watching the house, day and night." But Carlos, bruised and beaten, barely shrugged. "Let 'em watch," he said. "I'm giving myself up anyway." Now, here's the thing. That story, the one he told. People say it ain't the truth. The House Select Committee on Assassinations. They tapped some wires and uncovered the truth. Carlos didn't arrive on a commercial flight. He touched down in Miami aboard a Dominican Republic Air Force jet, flown in under the protection of General Rafael Trujillo, El Jefe himself. Trujillo wasn't just a dictator. He was a mob associate, a man whose empire thrived on mafia support. He was deeply entangled with organized crime, laundering drug money, running gambling operations and bribing officials, all while building casino empires with his underworld allies. His ties to the mob stretched from Havana to Las Vegas, and his partner in many of these ventures was none other than Santos Traficante, a close friend and business associate of Carlos Marcello. Trujillo wasn't the only one pulling strings. Irving Davidson, the notorious Capitol Hill lobbyist, was another crucial ally. Davidson, with his deep ties to both the Dominican Republic and Washington's power corridors, played fixer between the mob, foreign regimes, and U.S. politicians. But here's where it turns deadly. Carlos slipped back into the U.S. just days before Trujillo was gunned down. That hit wasn't rogue. It was sanctioned. The Central Intelligence Agency orchestrated it, and it carried Robert Kennedy's personal blessing. Why? Because Robert Kennedy knew exactly who Trujillo was. He knew about Trujillo's mafia ties, his drug routes, his casino rackets, and his bribery pipelines. He knew about the general's long-standing dealings with men like Traficante and Marcello. And most of all, he feared Trujillo's influence could spark another violent uprising in the Dominican Republic, one that would plunge the Caribbean deeper into chaos, just as the failed Bay of Pigs invasion had rattled Cuba. Kennedy decided Trujillo had to go, and that decision ignited a firestorm from New York to New Orleans to Florida. The mafia bosses, who had thrived under Trujillo's protection, were outraged. His assassination didn't just kill a dictator. It destroyed a pipeline of profit and protection that stretched from the Caribbean to the U.S. underworld. And in the shadows of this power play, one man quietly returned home. Carlos Marcello, carried on the wings of a dictator and shielded by the very forces that would soon tear his world apart. Carlos had for now beat them. He got back. But this wasn't a victory. This was something else, something worse. Because they hadn't just deported him, they'd humiliated him. They had dragged him through the mud, through the jungle, torn his body and stripped his pride. And there was only one man to blame. Not immigration, not the State Department. It was Bobby Kennedy. And Carlos Marcello never forgot. And he never forgave. On June the 2nd, 1961, America and organized crime figures across the world stood shaken. Some celebrated, especially those under attack from Kennedy's administration and the Cuban exiles who had once counted on Carlos Marcello's backing. Others, like the Kennedy brothers, were stunned. Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General and the architect behind Marcello's deportation, now faced his greatest frustration. Carlos Marcello was back. The Times broke the news first. Carlos Marcello, the kingpin of New Orleans' underworld, was back on American soil. Federal agents, chasing whispers and shadows, had tracked him to the Shreveport area. Patrick Duval of the U.S. Immigration Department's Border Patrol and Edwin Smith, his partner in the manhunt, had arrived from the New Orleans office, driven by a single promise. "We'll stay here until we arrest him." They were asking for help. Through the pages of the Times, they called on the public to report any sighting of the stocky 5'4" racketeer with his graying black hair and cold brown eyes. Duval was tight-lipped about how Marcello slipped back into the States from El Salvador, but he was certain of one thing. The gangster had been in Louisiana in recent days and wasn't far from familiar haunts. Shreveport was familiar ground for Marcello. He had business interests in nearby Bossier City and kept an attorney in the area, Michael Maroon, who had flown to Guatemala to negotiate for him after his sudden deportation in April. Maroon's name surfaced again as federal agents combed Marcello's known hideouts, including the infamous Town and Country Motel, a place where the racketeer had entertained powerful friends and shady associates. Duval warned, "When we catch him, he's facing a felony charge. Illegal re-entry without Justice Department approval." The pursuit was intense, with Caddo Parish Sheriff Howell Flournoy vowing full cooperation. The stakes were high. Marcello's departure on April 17th had been a spectacle swift operation that stripped him of his power base overnight. They had snatched him from his routine check-in at the New Orleans immigration office, tossed him on a plane to Guatemala without warning or luggage. His defiant cry of kidnapping had echoed through Guatemalan newspapers, but no amount of outcry could change the outcome. Once in Guatemala, Marcello had vanished. Officials claimed he was moved to El Salvador, but neither country wanted him. From there, he slipped into the shadows. Until now. The Bossier Press wasted no time taking credit for the scoop. Their editor boasted that 3 weeks earlier, on May 12th, they had hinted that Marcello was already back in Bossier City. Their source? 2 anonymous informants, described as patriotic Americans, and, in a jab at the administration, not as far to the left as some of the Washington crowd. The press suggested that the Justice Department's chase might be more for show than justice, implying that Robert Kennedy, mockingly nicknamed Bobby Socks Bobby, might have known more than he let on. The paper, known for stirring controversy, cast doubt on the entire manhunt, asking, "If Carlos is caught, will we be treated to another spectacle of showmanship for America's gullible public?" The Bossier Press, it seemed, wasn't chasing headlines. They were chasing ghosts and scandals. Meanwhile, the News Star reported a new twist. Marcello's lawyer, Michael Maroon, declared his client was ready to surrender. Maroon, the ever-cagey mouthpiece, refused to reveal Marcello's location, but promised a news conference later that day. Yet confusion reigned. Chief Border Patrol Inspector Gray, stationed in New Orleans, flatly denied knowing whether Marcello was even in the country. His statement clashed with Patrick Duval's assertion that the gangster had already been sighted in Shreveport. "He might be up there," Gray shrugged to reporters, "and he might not." But Duval stood firm. His investigation confirmed it. Somewhere in the backroads and backrooms of Louisiana, Carlos Marcello was out there. And with him, so was the Kennedy administration's worst nightmare. That the man they had fought for 9 years to expel could deny them once more, on their own turf. And so, it began. The hunt for Carlos Marcello was more than a search for a fugitive. It was a showdown between one man and the full weight of the American government. A man who had been declared unwanted by France, Italy, and the United States alike. A man whose empire had survived deportations, indictments, and congressional hearings. A man who now, against all odds, had come home. On June the 2nd, 1961, the man they couldn't get rid of was back. Carlos Marcello, the notorious boss of the New Orleans underworld, had slipped through the cracks of borders and bureaucracy to return to the only country he ever called home. The news broke with the force of a thunderclap. The Times was the first to confirm it. Federal agents were already swarming the Shreveport area, hot on his trail. Patrick Duval and Edwin Smith, both from the New Orleans Border Patrol office, weren't leaving until they had him in cuffs. The manhunt was public, messy, and desperate. Duval, tightening his lips in frustration, warned, "We'll get him. And when we do, he's facing another felony, illegal re-entry." But the feds weren't the only ones making moves. Michael Maroon, Marcello's longtime attorney from Shreveport, had stepped into the fray. He filed for a restraining order that could freeze any attempt to deport his client again. If granted, the order would let Marcello stay within the Western Louisiana District Court's jurisdiction, free on bond, while his appeal moved through the courts. The stakes came to a head before U.S. District Judge Ben C. Dawkins, Jr. on June 3, 1961. Judge Dawkins, a no-nonsense federal man, listened as Maroon, flanked by Jack Wasserman, a heavyweight attorney from Washington, promised that if the court granted the order, Marcello would walk in and surrender. But Assistant U.S. Attorneys Gilbert Zimmerman and Boagny, carrying the government's full force, pushed back hard. They demanded that the manhunt continue without pause. Maroon, sensing the net tightening around his client, confessed to the court that he had already notified federal agents on Wednesday, 2 days prior, that Marcello intended to surrender. But it was too late. The announcement had only thrown gasoline on the fire. The feds had doubled their numbers in Shreveport, sweeping every alley and motel room in a frenzied search to grab Marcello before he could claim the protection of the court. And then came the ruling. Judge Dawkins, his voice steady and cold, refused the restraining order. There was no proof, he said, that Marcello was even in his jurisdiction. Without it, his court had no power to halt the arrest. With that, the green light was given. The hunt continued. The following day, the chase was back at full tilt. Immigration officers, led by C. Johnson, the New Orleans district director, vowed to capture Marcello and deport him before he could set foot inside a courtroom. Johnson dismissed Maroon's claims of cooperation as theatrics. "This man won't talk to us," he said flatly, "so we'll find him first." The headlines grew more frenzied. Underworld, "Boss, Sakasa Kachal Shaka Chakdas Shatas, Bronshai." And for every agent on his trail, there was a whisper in the shadows. How had he even made it back into the States? Had someone helped him slip through the cracks? The answer came on Monday morning, and it wasn't the agents who found him. Carlos Marcello surrendered himself. No arrests, no chase through the back roads. Just a soft toot of a car horn outside his New Orleans home. When the immigration officer looked up from the driver's seat, the front door opened, and out stepped the man himself, bruised, battered, but walking tall. He climbed into the car without a word, his eyes hidden behind dark lenses, his mouth a straight line. Hours later, inside the immigration headquarters, his attorney Maroon made 3 demands. 3 hours alone with his client. A chance to post bond. That Marcello is not removed from Louisiana, even if bond was denied. But Maroon's voice carried little weight. He knew what was coming. "They'll make a grandstand play," he warned. "They'll ship him straight to McAllen, Texas, to the alien detention camp." And he wasn't wrong. By the time Marcello was processed, the Immigration Service refused to grant bail. They were holding him tight. His illegal re-entry had triggered a fresh charge, a felony, and the price was steep. Bond set at $50,000. But it didn't matter. Immigration retained custody, and no amount of money would buy his freedom. By Tuesday, the headlines read like a grim epitaph. Doors closed to crime boss Carlos Marcello, the man they called the little man in the underworld, had become something worse than a fugitive. He was a man without a country. 6 nations had slammed their doors in his face. Guatemala had deported him immediately, branding his birth records as forged. El Salvador marched him across the mountains to Honduras like a prisoner of war. Nicaragua refused him outright. Tunisia, the country he swore was his true birthplace, turned its back. Italy and France had already made their position clear: not welcome. Sitting in his cell, bruised ribs aching from his forced march through the Salvadoran mountains, Carlos Marcello faced a truth more brutal than any jail sentence. There was nowhere left to run. But if anyone thought this was the end of Carlos Marcello's story, they didn't know the man. The law had chased him across borders, over mountains, and through courtrooms, and he was still here. Carlos Marcello was more than just a crime boss. He was an architect of an invisible empire, stretching far beyond the swamps of Louisiana into the booming metropolises of Texas. And no city in the Lone Star State mattered more to him than Dallas. Dallas had no mafia family of its own, no native boss pulling the strings. It had gangsters, sure, gamblers, bookies, racketeers. But when it came to true power, it was a satellite of New Orleans. And in the world of organized crime, satellites didn't orbit on their own. They answered to one man. Marcello had spent years cultivating his grip over Texas, his influence creeping into every crack of the state's underworld. By the early 1960s, his network had become an independent, elaborately insulated operation, as one law enforcement official later put it. The Marcello machine ran smoothly: gambling, slot machines, narcotics, real estate, and a pipeline of bribes that kept the political machinery oiled and obedient. By 1963, Marcello's racing wire service fed hundreds of bookmakers in Houston, with each one paying up to $500 a day for access. It was the same playbook he had used in Louisiana: bankroll the bars and restaurants that would install his machines, finance the clubs and motels that would house his operations, and build a network of trusted men who could keep the operation running without his direct involvement. The money was staggering. Even a decade later, the Texas State Attorney General reported that Marcello's gambling syndicate in the state numbered over 800 bookmakers, handling revenues in the millions. And that was just what was known. But gambling was only part of the equation. Marcello had a foothold in industries that were far more difficult to trace. The Pelican Tomato Company, for instance, was one of the biggest importers of tomatoes from Mexico, its largest single customer none other than the US Navy. It was a legitimate front, but one with a darker underside. Customs officials looked the other way, and no one dared to ask what else might be getting shipped across the border. The Marcello influence wasn't just economic, it was political. Texas had been bought and paid for, one campaign at a time. His key bagman in the state, a man named Jack Halfon, made sure of it. Halfon funneled a portion of Marcello's illegal profits straight into the pockets of Texas power players, men like Houston Congressman Albert Thomas, Supreme Court Associate Justice Tom Clark, and, most notably, U.S. Senator Lyndon Johnson. It was estimated that at least $50,000 a year from Marcello's gambling profits alone ended up in Johnson's coffers. And, in return, Johnson helped ensure that any federal legislation that might harm Marcello's business interests never made it out of committee. With Vice President Johnson in his corner, Marcello had a protective shield that even Robert Kennedy's war on organized crime couldn't penetrate. Dallas in 1963 was Marcello's playground. The police? Bought. The politicians? Complicit. His enforcer? A Sicilian-born, Louisiana-raised gangster named Joseph Civello. Civello had been a key figure in the underworld for decades. A bookmaker, a liquor dealer, a suspected murderer, and a narcotics smuggler who had been Marcello's man in Dallas for years. He was so trusted that in 1957, when the top mafia bosses in the country gathered in Appalachian, New York, it was Civello whom Marcello sent as his personal representative. He returned to Dallas to a storm of negative press, but the heat didn't last long. The city's police force, which had long ignored his dealings, kept his name out of any real trouble. And then there was Jack Ruby. 6 years after Appalachian, Civello's influence still ran through Dallas like a live wire. He was leasing Marcello's slot machines, running the racing wire service, and keeping a tight grip on the local underworld. He also had close ties to another Sicilian family in the city, the Campisis. Joe and Sam Campisi were restaurant owners, but their Egyptian lounge was far more than just a place to eat. It was an underworld meeting ground, a place where deals were made, and where men like Civello came and went through the back door, unseen by the general public, but well known to the FBI. One name that would later surface in connection with the Campisis: Lee Harvey Oswald's killer. In the days before he shot Oswald in the basement of the Dallas police headquarters, Jack Ruby ate dinner at the Egyptian lounge. The Campisis, like Civello, had been long-time friends of Carlos Marcello. The connections were deep. Too deep. The FBI later found extensive phone records linking Marcello's enterprises in New Orleans to Campisi's restaurant in Dallas. And in 1978, when investigators finally questioned Joe Campisi, he admitted to a long-standing friendship with Marcello. He even bragged about how every Christmas he sent Marcello 260 pounds of Italian sausage, made special with walnuts and celery. By the time 1963 rolled around, the Marcello organization operated with impunity in Dallas. Their men weren't just bookies and club owners. They were embedded in the police force itself. One sergeant, Patrick Dean, was so deeply tied to the organization that he was spotted having dinner with Civello just days after the Appalachian meeting. That same Sergeant Dean would be in charge of basement security at the Dallas police headquarters when Jack Ruby pulled the trigger and silenced Lee Harvey Oswald forever. The Mafia had a saying, "Nothing is a coincidence." Years later, the Warren Commission would dismiss any organized crime connection to the assassination of John F. Kennedy. But those who had spent their lives studying the underworld knew better. Dallas was Marcello's city. His men controlled the rackets. His men controlled the police. And when the most shocking event in modern American history unfolded in the streets of Dealey Plaza, his network was already in place. But even before the shots rang out in Dallas, the winds of change were blowing. By the mid-1970s, law enforcement agencies were finally starting to put the pieces together. The Texas Organized Crime Prevention Council identified over 160 men in the state with mafia ties, 32 of them full members. The Associated Press launched a probe into the state's underworld, interviewing a former mafia leader who had come to Texas looking for a fresh start, only to find that the mob had beaten him there. "It's a great big watermelon," the man told the reporters, "ripe for the plucking." The pluckers had arrived. Even beyond the old Marcello network, fresh players were making moves. The West Coast Mafia was beginning to challenge the New Orleans hold over Texas. Old alliances were fraying, and rival factions were circling. In a Dallas hotel club, an aging East Coast mobster sat down for dinner, his .38 caliber pistol hidden beneath a red napkin, watching, waiting. The mobsters in Texas, he said, were getting ready for the day when gambling would be legalized in the state. Massive land holdings had already been secured, bribes had already been paid, and politicians had already been bought. But the key to everything? Getting the right people in your pocket. Carlos Marcello had done that better than anyone. Even as law enforcement cracked down, even as new enemies emerged, the little man of New Orleans still had his grip on Texas. His name was whispered in connection with a real estate empire tied to the mob. His men still controlled gambling rings in Dallas and Houston, and his people still moved money through seemingly legitimate businesses. But the clock was ticking. Federal prosecutors were coming after him. Investigators were digging deeper into his ties to politicians and businesses across Texas. The headlines were catching up to the rumors. And for the first time in decades, there was the hint of something Marcello had never had to deal with before. A war on the horizon. The Kennedy assassination was barely over before the coincidences began stacking up. Coincidences that in the world of Carlos Marcello, Jimmy Hoffa, and David Ferrie weren't coincidences at all. One name kept surfacing again and again. David Ferrie. Ferrie, the bizarre red wig-wearing pilot with a penchant for young boys and high-stakes gambling. A man who had been close to Oswald since 1955, years before the world would even know the name Lee Harvey Oswald. A man who worked not only for Carlos Marcello, but whose name was whispered in CIA circles. And, if Frank Sheeran's story was true, a man whose role in the assassination was more than just a footnote. Sheeran, the Irishman, a trusted enforcer for Russell Bufalino and a confidant of Jimmy Hoffa, had kept his mouth shut for decades. But when he finally talked, the details were staggering. In 1963, Hoffa had sent Sheeran on a delivery. A duffel bag containing 3 to 4 rifles, flown from Baltimore to a destination unknown. Sheeran, never one to ask too many questions, didn't open the bag, didn't handle the weapons. But he knew what they were for. A contingency, a backup. Because things like this needed backup. The FBI file on Tony Provenzano backed up Sheeran's story. On the exact date Sheeran claimed he made the drop, an Irish-looking individual matching Sheeran's description was seen picking up a rucksack under surveillance. Coincidence? Not likely. The November 21, 2015 documentary Capturing Oswald filled in more gaps. Detective Jim Livell, the officer handcuffed to Oswald when Jack Ruby fired the fatal shot, dropped the bombshell. They had laid out 3 or 4 routes to take. The president's motorcade had multiple possible paths, any of which could have been chosen at the last minute, which meant backup rifle teams were necessary. The Baltimore Rifles, one of those contingencies. Then there was Sergeant Patrick Dean, a Dallas police officer with deep ties to the Dallas underworld. Dean had sat down with Joseph Civello, the head of Marcello's Dallas operations, just days before the assassination. And who was in charge of Oswald's security detail once he was arrested? Sergeant Patrick Dean, the same Sergeant Dean who was the planted witness for Melvin Belly, Jack Ruby's lawyer. The same Sergeant Dean who, it's now believed, was the man who leaked the final motorcade route to his Mafia co-conspirators. Because if there were 4 potential routes, the Mafia needed to know which one would be chosen. And someone inside the Dallas Police Department had to give them that answer. Oswald was on the inside. He knew which route was his responsibility. He had his own rifle, the one he was comfortable with, but he was never meant to survive past Sunday morning. Jack Ruby, Marcello's man, made sure of that. While the world's eyes were on Dallas, where President John Kennedy's motorcade rolled through Dealey Plaza, something else was unfolding in New Orleans. In a federal courtroom, Carlos Marcello, the man Bobby Kennedy once called the most powerful racketeer in the country, was watching the final act of his latest battle with the United States government. The stakes? Conspiracy charges. The government claimed Marcello and his brother Joseph had cooked up a phony Guatemalan birth certificate, a slick maneuver from back in 1956, meant to throw off the feds who were trying to ship him to Italy. The whole case reflected the government's obsession with Carlos, an obsession that wore Bobby Kennedy's fingerprints from top to bottom. 2 weeks the trial ran, and by that Friday morning they were almost at the finish line. U.S. District Judge Herbert Christenberry had already knocked down the defense's motion for an acquittal. The case was going to the jury. But the government's star witness, a man named Carl Irving Knoll, and Knoll was a problem. Knoll was a classic hustler, a con man, according to Mrs. Yvonne Klein, a woman from Wilmette, Illinois, who torched his credibility on the stand. Knoll had claimed he bribed Guatemalan officials to get Marcello's fake birth certificate, but Mrs. Klein told the jury that Knoll had actually made those trips for her, tied to some grand, far-fetched, $200 million building project. The government's carefully built, started to sag under its own weight. But then came the timing. That timing. As the jury deliberated, the news broke from Dallas. The president, Bobby's brother, shot, dead. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, but the proceedings didn't stop. Marcello, stone-faced, watched and waited. Carlos Marcello sat in a courtroom in New Orleans, expressionless, as Judge Herbert Christenberry delivered his charge to the jury. The air was thick with tension. This was the moment that would decide his fate. The case had been long, draining, and for Marcello, personal. The full weight of Robert Kennedy's Justice Department had been thrown against him. And now, after years of fighting, it all came down to this. Then the courtroom door swung open. A bailiff hurried to the judge's bench and handed him a note. Christenberry read it in silence. His face paled. The tension shifted, morphed into something heavier, something that had nothing to do with Carlos Marcello. When the judge finally spoke, his voice wavered. The president has been shot in Dallas and is feared dead. The courtroom erupted, murmurs, gasps, a rising wave of confusion that had to be tamped down by the judge himself. The world had just changed. But Carlos Marcello and his brother Joe, they showed nothing. No emotion, no reaction. As chaos unfolded around them, they calmly rose from their seats, buttoned their jackets, and walked out with their attorneys. Meanwhile, across the country, in the quiet of his Virginia estate, Robert Kennedy sat poolside, eating a lunch of clam chowder and tuna fish sandwiches with two of his closest allies, Robert Morgenthau and Silvio Mollo, the men leading his crusade against organized crime. The phone rang. It was Hoover. "I have news for you. The president's been shot." The voice on the other end was clinical, emotionless, almost robotic. Kennedy gripped the receiver, his mind reeling. "I think it's serious. I'll call you back when I find out more." And then, 30 minutes later, Hoover called again, his tone unchanged. "The president's dead." Bobby Kennedy said nothing. The man who had spent years wielding the full power of the Justice Department, who had made it his mission to crush men like Carlos Marcello, sat frozen. The war he had waged had just taken a turn he had never anticipated. His brother, his protector, his shield, was gone. At that exact moment in New Orleans, the courtroom reconvened. By 3 in the afternoon, the jury had returned. At 15 minutes past 3, the foreman stood to read the verdict. On the charge of conspiracy, not guilty. On the charge of perjury, not guilty. A total acquittal. Carlos Marcello, the man Robert Kennedy had spent years hunting, the man whose empire the Justice Department had tried and failed to dismantle, had walked free on the very day his greatest enemy had been eliminated. Outside the courthouse, Marcello barely acknowledged his victory. He shook hands with his attorneys, accepted congratulations from friends and family, but there was no celebration, no parade. He walked out arm in arm with his wife, climbed into a waiting car, and disappeared into the city. According to one observer, he was all business, skipping any family gathering to head straight to his office at the Town and Country Motel. There was something urgent on his mind. Hours later, at New Orleans International Airport, 2 men met in the shadows, George Alamilla and Rudolf Heitler. Heitler had been a juror in Marcello's trial, one of the 12 who had just voted not guilty. Now, in a quiet exchange, Heitler admitted that not only had he voted for Marcello's acquittal, but he had convinced several of his fellow jurors to do the same. Alamilla didn't hesitate. Heitler had done a great job. The next day, he was to see Joe Matassa, Marcello's man, for his reward. The timing was impossible to ignore. 1 year earlier, in September 1962, in the private confines of Churchill Farms, Carlos Marcello had spat out a Sicilian proverb to an associate. "A dog will keep biting you if you cut off its tail. But if you cut off its head, the dog will die, tail and all." A year later, John Kennedy was dead. The old order had crumbled, the power dynamic had shifted, and those who had been under siege from Bobby Kennedy's war on organized crime were now breathing easier. Jimmy Hoffa, a man who had suffered under the relentless legal attacks of the Kennedy brothers, was blunt in his reaction. When the news of the assassination reached him, he sneered, "Bobby Kennedy is just another lawyer now. Perhaps even less than that." In the weeks that followed, Robert Kennedy fell into a state of paralysis. To those around him, he seemed broken. Pierre Salinger, the former White House press secretary, later recalled that he was the most shattered man he had ever seen. A Justice Department official put it more bluntly. He was non-functioning. The war against the mob lost its momentum, and Carlos Marcello, he remained untouchable. There would be investigations, whispers, and theories, hushed discussions in Washington, tense conversations behind closed doors. But the reality was simple. The government's war against Carlos Marcello had ended the moment John Kennedy died. Marcello wasn't finished, though. Not by a long shot. In the coming years, the fallout will spread. More names would be dragged into the conspiracy: Jack Ruby, Joseph Civello, Joe Campisi, and a web of connections that stretched from Dallas to New Orleans. But on November 22nd, 1963, the most powerful mafia boss in the South walked out of a courtroom a free man, his empire intact, his war won. And Robert Kennedy. He was alone in the wreckage. Carlos Marcello sat in his office at the Town and Country Motel, his inner sanctum, surrounded by men who had seen wars waged in courtrooms, alleys, and backrooms. He had beaten the United States government, embarrassed Robert Kennedy, and walked free on the very day the President of the United States had been shot dead in Dallas. Fate, it seemed, had a twisted sense of irony. Then the news came. A phone call. A whisper in the ear. Doots Murrett's kid had been arrested in Dallas. The name didn't mean much to most. But to Marcello, it did. Lee Harvey Oswald, the boy from New Orleans, a nobody, a drifter, but now a suspect in the most explosive murder in American history. If Marcello had any connection to the assassination, if there was even the faintest trace back to him, then Oswald's arrest wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a catastrophe. He had spent years building an empire that stretched from New Orleans to Dallas, Houston to Shreveport, Baton Rouge to Miami. It had survived deportation, FBI investigations, and Senate hearings. But an empire was only as strong as its weakest link. And now Lee Oswald was sitting in a Dallas jail cell, facing police officers, and God knows how many federal agents. Carlos Marcello knew what needed to be done. Inside the interrogation room at Dallas Police Headquarters, Lee Harvey Oswald sat under the harsh glare of overhead lights. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, the walls vibrating with the chatter of reporters, officers, and federal agents scrambling to make sense of the unthinkable. The President of the United States was dead, and the suspect sitting in front of them was an enigma wrapped in contradictions. A former US Marine who had defected to the Soviet Union, only to return under bizarre and unexplained circumstances. A man who had recently been in New Orleans, causing a scene with pro-Castro leaflets, and yet was deeply connected to the very forces that despised Castro the most. A man who, in custody, kept repeating one phrase over and over: "I'm just a patsy." As the interrogation stretched into the night, Oswald's family began arriving at the police station. First his mother, Marguerite Oswald, a woman who talked fast and had no filter. From the moment she arrived, she was loud, insistent, and unapologetically conspiratorial. "My son," she declared, "was working for the United States government." The detectives barely reacted. Half of them thought she was just another overdramatic mother in denial. But as she kept talking, some of them found themselves shifting in their chairs. "He was a patriot," she insisted. "He went to Russia on behalf of the CIA. He was sent there. And now they're trying to blame him for something he didn't do." It sounded insane, but decades later, investigators would discover that she wasn't far off the mark. Oswald had ties to the CIA. Oswald had been part of intelligence operations. And Oswald was not just some random drifter who snapped one day and killed the president. To Carlos Marcello, however, that's exactly what Oswald would have looked like. A nobody, a hothead, a man who had been in the wrong places, at the wrong times, with the wrong people. But Oswald's past wasn't as simple as it seemed. Before Dallas, before November 22nd, 1963, before his mugshot was plastered on front pages across the world, Lee Harvey Oswald had been in New Orleans. And in New Orleans, Oswald had been part of something bigger. He had ties to men like David Ferrie, a CIA-linked pilot who worked for Carlos Marcello, to men like Guy Bannister, a former FBI agent turned anti-Castro extremist with an office at 544 Camp Street, the same building Oswald used for his so-called pro-Castro organization. Oswald had been part of something that, on the surface, made no sense. He was openly handing out pro-Castro leaflets, yet he was surrounded by anti-Castro operatives. He was loudly defending the Cuban Revolution, yet he had been spotted in the company of anti-Castro Cuban exiles. He was arrested for a staged street fight with Cuban exiles, but instead of quietly leaving, he demanded to be taken to the police station and filed paperwork. Why? Because Oswald was building a cover story. The DRE, Directorio Revolucionario Estudiantil, a Cuban exile group funded by the CIA, was running a misinformation campaign in New Orleans, and Oswald was a piece of that puzzle. The staged fight, the pamphlets, the arrest, it was all an act, a way to paint Oswald as a radical nobody, a pro-Castro lone wolf. And when the time came, that false persona would be his death sentence. Because the moment Kennedy was shot, Oswald's past wasn't going to be investigated, it was going to be used against him. By Saturday, November 23rd, as the nation mourned its fallen leader, David Ferrie, one of Marcello's most trusted operatives, was already moving. Ferrie had left New Orleans in the early evening of the 22nd, tearing across the highway in a light blue Comet station wagon, a Texas thunderstorm raging overhead. By 4 in the morning, Ferrie and 2 companions, Alvin Bobeuf and Melvin Coffey, pulled into the Ala Motel in Houston, a property owned by Marcello. Exhausted, soaked, but on a mission, Ferrie wasted no time. He placed a call straight to the Town and Country Motel in New Orleans. The FBI later claimed Ferrie called Marcello's attorney, Ray Gill, but Gill wasn't supposed to be there that Saturday. And he wasn't. The call, almost certainly, was for Carlos Marcello himself. That weekend, Joe Matassa, Marcello's partner in the Pelican Tomato Company, was in a panic. He had promised ex-juror Rudolf Hitler a payoff for his not guilty vote in Marcello's trial. But now, Matassa couldn't reach Marcello. "He's laying low," Matassa told Hitler. "He's hard to get a hold of." And that was true. Marcello disappeared. The Town and Country Motel had too many eyes, too many phones tapped, too many informants lurking in the shadows. If Oswald's name meant something, if Ferrie's desperate drive to Texas meant something, then Marcello needed to be somewhere no one could reach him. He had a fortress for moments like this. Churchill Farms. That's where he likely went. His vast 6,000-acre compound outside New Orleans, a place where men came in but never came out. There, far from reporters and wiretaps, he could work in silence, letting the cleanup unfold on its own. Meanwhile, David Ferrie's name was about to explode onto the front pages. The night of the assassination, Ferrie's longtime associate, Guy Bannister, got into a violent bar fight with an investigator named Jack Martin. Bannister was a former FBI agent turned private investigator, running his operation out of 544 Camp Street, a building that just happened to be linked to Lee Harvey Oswald's Fair Play for Cuba committee. The fight started over money, but as the argument escalated, Jack Martin, drunk, angry, and maybe scared, blurted out something chilling. "What are you going to do? Kill me like you all did Kennedy?" Bannister snapped. He grabbed his .357 Magnum, pistol-whipped Martin across the face, and beat him until blood ran down his scalp. Martin didn't call the police that night, but the next day he started talking. By Sunday, November 24th, Jack Martin had reached out to a friend in the New Orleans District Attorney's office. He had something to say about the Kennedy assassination, and it had to do with David Ferrie. By Monday, November 25th, the New Orleans police, FBI, and Secret Service were all looking for Ferrie. Jack Martin's tip had made its way to Assistant District Attorney Herman Coleman, and suddenly, Ferrie's rush to Houston didn't look so innocent. Where was Ferrie? Carlos Marcello's lawyer, Ray Gill, suddenly had the answer. "Ferrie's been in Texas," he told the DA's office, "but he'll be back in New Orleans soon." When Ferrie finally turned himself in, he played it cool. He claimed the trip to Texas had nothing to do with Kennedy. He had just gone ice skating in Houston. It was the weakest excuse in the history of alibis. The FBI interrogated him. Secret Service grilled him. But they had nothing to hold him on. Ferrie walked free. A clean-up complete. Oswald is silenced. But the real problem, the biggest problem of all, was still sitting in a Dallas jail cell. Lee Harvey Oswald. Marcello, if he were involved, would have known that Oswald needed to be silenced. Immediately. And that was a job that could only be done by someone inside the Dallas underworld. Enter Jack Ruby. Ruby was no lone gunman. He was a mob-connected nightclub owner, a man who had done business with the Campisi brothers, Joe and Sam, longtime Marcello allies. On Sunday morning, November 24th, 1963, Ruby received a mysterious phone call. Moments later, he grabbed his Colt Cobra revolver, left his apartment, and headed to the Dallas police headquarters. At 20 minutes past 11 in the morning, as millions watched on live television, Ruby pushed through the crowd, raised his gun, and fired a single bullet into Lee Harvey Oswald's gut. Oswald gasped, fell, and died less than 2 hours later. The weakest link had been severed. Years later, House Select Committee investigators would dig deep into Marcello's Dallas connections. They found that Oswald had ties to New Orleans. Oswald had been linked to David Ferrie as early as 1955. Marcello and Ferrie had an airtight alibi for November 22nd, but crime bosses always arranged airtight alibis before big jobs. Jack Ruby was a longtime associate of Marcello's Dallas contacts, and yet Carlos Marcello never spent a day in prison for anything related to the Kennedy assassination. Because in the world of organized crime, the best killings are the ones you never have to explain. Carlos Marcello, the little man, had cut off the head of the dog and lived the rest of his life in the shadows. On the night of November 20th, 1963, the small Louisiana town of Eunice had no idea it was about to brush against history. Lieutenant Francis Fruge of the Louisiana State Police was called to the emergency room at Moussa Memorial Hospital. A woman, disheveled, bruised, mumbling incoherently, had been struck by a car outside the Silver Slipper Lounge. Her name was Rose Cheramie. To most, she looked like another lost soul tangled in narcotics and madness. But to Fruge, she was something else entirely. The hospital staff wanted her gone. They believed she was on drugs, maybe hallucinating. With no next of kin, nowhere to take her, Fruge had her booked into the local jail for the night. But within hours, she'd be transferred to the East Louisiana State Hospital, in a straitjacket, still groggy, still muttering something about Dallas, about Cubans, about killing the president. 2 days later, John Kennedy would be dead. Cheramie had made a stunning claim on the ride to the hospital. "They're going to kill Kennedy in Dallas." She didn't just blurt it out. She said it like a fact, like a weather forecast. The men she had been traveling with, Cubans or Italians, she wasn't sure, were tied to a narcotics pipeline running from Miami through Texas and into Mexico. But killing Kennedy? Fruge didn't take it seriously until the news broke on November 22nd. And that's where the story fractures into something far more sinister. What began as a freak roadside accident unraveled into a tale of narcotics trafficking, Cuban exiles, and organized crime. Cheramie had been en route from Miami to Dallas, allegedly collecting a heroin shipment in Houston. She spoke of being used as a courier, a pawn in a game that spanned state lines and continents. Her prediction of Kennedy's death, made while in custody, later proved to be more than a coincidence. Fruge documented everything. After Kennedy's death, he escalated the case to his superiors, alerting Colonel Morgan of the state police. The information was passed to U.S. Customs, and soon Fruge, Cheramie, and state agents were flown to Houston in a desperate attempt to intercept the drug shipment she'd described. Customs confirmed much of her story: the hotel reservation, the ship, the names. It all checked out. But the narcotics operation fell apart. The seaman slipped away, the money man vanished, and Cheramie, once again, was left to drift back into the shadows. And that's when things got darker. Cheramie disappeared for a while. Then, in 1965, she turned up dead, struck by another vehicle on a Texas highway, her skull fractured, her body dumped and forgotten. Just like before. He sat in silence. Not just any silence, the kind that hung in the air like a noose. The news had just reached him. President John Kennedy was dead, shot in broad daylight. The man who once led one of the most secretive and feared mafia empires in American history didn't scream. He didn't speak. He twitched. A faint flicker in his left eye, a subtle shift in his seat, as if some part of him already knew. Or at least suspected. Maybe it wasn't us. Maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't my son, but the man who took over. Maybe it was the machine we built. A machine that once played kingmaker in the South, which greased the wheels of local politics like it was business as usual, that now had the kind of reach that made presidents sweat. And then came Jack Ruby. Like a ghost from nowhere, stepping forward and silencing Lee Harvey Oswald in front of the world. That's when the silence broke. He knew, not suspected, knew. That method, that execution, it wasn't foreign to him. It was textbook. His family had used it for decades. Set up the fall guy, let the heat settle, then silence the fall guy before he starts singing. Clean, quick, permanent. They used orphans from Sicily for jobs like this. Kids with no last name, no strings, no mothers crying on front steps. Train them to shoot. Give them a storefront, a little cash, a sense of purpose. Then whisper in their ear, "Do you want to keep all this? Earn it. Shoot that man." They'd pull the trigger, and just like that their story would end. A bullet from someone even more trusted. And now, back in America, the pattern was repeating. Oswald was the patsy, Ruby was the silencer. But why? Why would Jack Ruby, a guy with a bad temper and a soft spot for his siblings, step into the lion's den, knowing he'd never walk back out? Because he was connected. To the New Orleans crew, to the outfit, to the CIA. Jack Ruby wasn't just a hot-headed nightclub owner. He had a rap sheet and a reputation. Brass knuckles in one hand, a blackjack in the other. He pistol-whipped people for fun. He stomped on necks. But he loved his sister Ava and his brother Earl. They were all tied into it. Nightclubs, dry cleaners. Perfect fronts for washing dirty cash. Especially in a city like Dallas, where the New Orleans outfit had fingers in every pie, and the night before the assassination, Ruby had dinner at the Egyptian Lounge with Joe Campisi, the future Dallas boss and underboss to Joseph Civello. Campisi wasn't just serving food, he was serving instructions. The next day, Oswald would die. After Ruby fired the fatal shot and got arrested, the first man to visit him wasn't a lawyer. It was Campisi. He didn't need to say much. He didn't threaten. He didn't have to. Just mentioning the sheriff who helped Civello get a pardon was threat enough. Just standing there was a message. Play ball, keep your mouth shut. Your family stays safe. That was the unspoken deal. Ruby would take the fall, but the family would protect Eva, Earl, and everything they'd built. But Jack Ruby had other plans. He asked for a transfer, not just out of Dallas, but to Washington. He begged Earl Warren, head of the President's Commission, to move him. "Unless you get me to Washington, you cannot get a fair shake out of me." That was Ruby's moment. That was the tell. He was ready to flip. Warren denied the request. Ruby repeated it again. "Maybe certain people don't want to know the truth that may come out of me." And he was right. They didn't. Warren knew the implications. If Ruby got to Washington, if he opened his mouth in front of the right people, the whole deck of cards could collapse. That wasn't a prison transfer. It was a confession waiting to happen. Instead, Warren met Ruby in Dallas, without the 2 staff lawyers assigned to investigate him. Leon Hubert and Bert Griffin were frozen out. Griffin, determined to get answers, pushed anyway. He interrogated Sergeant Patrick Dean, the officer in charge of security during Oswald's transfer. Dean lied. Twice. First, about when Ruby supposedly decided to shoot Oswald. Second, about watching Ruby descend the ramp and doing nothing to stop him. Griffin smelled the rot. He told Dean to come back with a lawyer. Dean didn't. He ran straight to Henry Wade, Dallas's district attorney and a close friend of President Lyndon Johnson. Within days, Earl Warren shut Griffin down, shipped him back to Washington, told him he'd never question another Dallas cop again. Then, in a final insult, Sergeant Dean brought to Washington and gave him a public apology. "No member of our staff has a right to tell any witness that he is lying." The message was clear. Truth wasn't welcome here in Ruby. He was left to rot in the sheriff's jail, the very place he feared the most. 3 hours after Oswald's murder, Ruby told FBI agent Ray Hall, "If he had confessed to shooting the president, I probably would never have shot him. Since he hadn't confessed, I was afraid he might be turned loose." But that was a lie, and it revealed more than Ruby intended. How did he know Oswald hadn't confessed? It was still early Sunday morning. No statements had been made public. Unless someone was feeding him inside information, maybe Sergeant Dean, maybe someone higher up. The timeline didn't make sense. Ruby wasn't acting on impulse. He was following instructions, and the lie he told about fearing Oswald would beat the rap was just cover for the real motive, to silence the only man who could talk. Earl Warren could have cracked it all wide open, but he didn't. He let it lie. Jack Ruby had made his offer. One transfer, one fair shake, one truth that might have changed everything. They left him in Dallas, and the truth died with him. When Kennedy fell in Dallas, something cracked in Guy Bannister. On November 22, 1963, the very day President John Kennedy was assassinated, Bannister exploded. He turned on his own associate, Jack Martin, in a rage that was anything but random. The two had fought before, but this was different. The shouting was louder. The fear was real, and this time Bannister pistol-whipped Martin so viciously it left him bloody and rambling about names, files, and connections, about Oswald, Ferrie, and the Camp Street office they all shared. Bannister's world was unraveling. Fast. This was a man who once held power. A former FBI agent, former assistant police chief in New Orleans, and now a private investigator playing both sides of every street in the French Quarter, but still very loyal to Carlos Marcello. But now he was becoming a liability. He walked around in the days following the assassination, muttering praise for Oswald. "You can't judge a book by its cover," he reportedly said. "Who would have thought the kid had the balls to go through with it?" That kind of talk didn't just raise eyebrows. It sent shivers through the underworld. Loose lips like Bannister's weren't just dangerous, they were deadly. And as 1964 rolled in, Bannister's behavior got worse. Erratic, reckless. He was drinking more, ranting more. And then came the night he really crossed the line. March 31st, 1964. New Orleans. A city bus. Bannister, drunk and belligerent, got into a brawl with 3 young men after one of them made a comment about his woman companion. One of them called him darling, and that was all it took. He pulled a gun. On a public bus. A window shattered. The gun went missing. No one was shot, but the damage was done. Guy Bannister was arrested for aggravated assault. Once a respected lawman, now a mess of rage, paranoia, and broken glass. The papers ran with it. Former New Orleans officer arrested after gun-waving brawl. A bus driver had to break up the fight. Bannister was booked at the 3rd District Station. The streets had turned on him. The cops didn't fear him anymore. His badge didn't mean a damn thing now, and the worst part, Carlos Marcello didn't come. There was no lawyer waiting with a briefcase, no envelope of cash, no favor to call in. Bannister had played too close to the flame. He had set up shop next to Lee Harvey Oswald, worked with David Ferrie, tied himself to shadows that were never meant to be seen, and now the heat was too much. By June 1964, New Orleans woke to the news. Guy Bannister was dead, found at home. Died unexpectedly, the obituary said. There was no autopsy, no investigation, just silence. His funeral was held quietly at Mulhern Funeral Home. Masonic rites, a few pallbearers, a clean headstone at Riverview Cemetery. They spoke of his years in the FBI, his crusade against corruption in the New Orleans Police Department, his campaign for city council. They said nothing of Camp Street, nothing of Oswald, nothing of the gun on the bus or the beating of Jack Martin. Because by then, everyone understood what had happened. He was no longer useful. He was talking too much, and no one, not Marcello, not the CIA, not the men who really ran New Orleans, was going to let Guy Bannister keep talking. He'd known the kid since 1955. Lee Harvey Oswald was just 16 then, skinny, fatherless, angry at the world, and looking for something to believe in. That's when he met David Ferrie, the eccentric pilot with no eyebrows, a loud laugh, and quiet ties to both Carlos Marcello's criminal empire and shadowy government contractors. Ferrie didn't just teach Oswald the art of espionage, he taught him how to disappear, how to live a life in the shadows, how to lie with a straight face. Oswald, still a boy, soaked it all in. He was born in New Orleans, the city of masks. His family, already tangled in the local numbers racket, was close to Sam Sawyer's crew, and his uncle, Charles Dutz Murrett, was tied tight. The Murretts were not minor players. They were bookmakers, bagmen, quiet earners for Carlos Marcello's outfit. So when people say Oswald was a nobody, they're either lying or looking the other way. David Ferrie never looked the other way. Even after Oswald defected to Russia, married a Soviet wife, and returned home with a child, Ferrie welcomed him back like a long-lost nephew. Because this wasn't about patriotism. It was about utility and Oswald. He was useful. People had seen them together, not just in New Orleans, but in Jack Ruby's nightclub in Dallas. Dancers, comedians, even a few drunks came forward to say they saw Oswald with Ruby and Ferrie, and they weren't exactly hiding it. Ruby introduced them as CIA. And maybe in their own twisted way they were. But truth was messier than that. At that point, both Ferrie and Oswald were working for Guy Bannister and indirectly for Carlos Marcello. Ferrie was the recruiter, the trainer, the manipulator. Oswald was the tool. When Oswald failed to infiltrate pro-Castro groups and couldn't get into Cuba, Ferrie offered him a new mission, one that would change the world. The president was coming to Dallas. The motorcade was scheduled to pass directly in front of the Texas School Book Depository. A coincidence? Maybe. But Oswald was already working there. The headlines printed the motorcade route in bold, black ink. Marcello and Ferrie read them like a blueprint. They had mocked Dallas as death for Kennedy. And now the window was open. Oswald made his move. He went back to the house he shared with his wife and 2 children and retrieved his rifle. It was November 21st, 1963. That morning, Lee Harvey Oswald took the rifle from the garage of Ruth Payne's home in Irving, Texas. Quietly, deliberately. He had stashed it there in secret, weeks before. That night, he returned to Dallas alone. Lee and Marina Oswald had been living under Ruth Payne's roof in the quiet suburb of Irving. The arrangement had come out of desperation. Their marriage was fracturing. Oswald's moods were growing darker. Ruth, a Quaker and a vocal supporter of civil rights, had opened her home to Marina out of compassion, trying to offer stability to a young woman who barely spoke English and was trapped in a foreign world with an unpredictable husband. Ruth had no idea what was coming. Neither did Marina. Oswald's visit that Thursday night was unannounced. He showed up, stayed the night, then left the next morning with a long, slender package. When asked, he said it was curtain rods. But that was a lie. Inside the package was the rifle, the one that would forever change history. But this wasn't the act of a man planning a lone wolf assassination. If Oswald had truly decided on his own to kill the president, he wouldn't have left his weapon behind. He wouldn't have waited until the night before to retrieve it. He would have had it with him from the moment Kennedy's Dallas visit was confirmed. But he didn't, because he wasn't planning to die. He was planning to get out. Oswald knew he needed an escape, an extraction, and there was only one man he trusted to make that happen. David Ferrie. The eccentric former pilot. The mentor. The handler. Ferrie had the means, access to planes, private airstrips, and quiet connections. And more importantly, he had the muscle behind him, the political favors, the police on payroll, the backing of men like Campisi, Civello, and Carlos Marcello. Oswald believed the machine could protect him, that once the job was done, he'd vanish, flown out of Texas and into the shadows. But it wasn't just about pulling the trigger. There had to be a lookout. The weather needed to hold. If rain struck Dallas and the skies opened up, the Secret Service would slap the bubble top onto the presidential limousine, and the entire operation would fall apart. They needed clear skies. They needed certainty. That's why Oswald was seen by the payphone just minutes before the motorcade turned down Elm Street. He was waiting for the go-ahead. Someone, maybe a lookout, maybe one of Sergeant Dean's men, maybe one of Marcello's men made the call. The signal came through. The sky was clear, the roof was off, the president was exposed. Oswald climbed the stairs. He took position. He aimed, and he fired. Maybe he wasn't alone. Maybe there were others. But Oswald was up there. And once he pulled that trigger, he was never meant to walk away. The real plan had already been drawn. After the hit, friendly faces in the Dallas Police Department, those with connections to the outfit, were supposed to scoop Oswald up quietly. No mugshots, no press. Take him to a private airstrip. Ferrie would be waiting. The plane would carry him to Mexico, then on to Cuba. It was supposed to be clean. That's what Ferrie believed. Because no matter what else he was, he had known Lee Harvey Oswald since he was a teenager. He wasn't going to set him up for slaughter. At least, not knowingly. Both men believed they had a way out. But plans change. And no one changed a plan like the mob. At the last minute, they turned the tables. There was no extraction, no airstrip, no flight to safety. Oswald had no idea. Ferrie stayed behind in New Orleans with Carlos Marcello. And Oswald, he was left holding the rifle. The final patsy in a deadly theater of shadows. The frame-up was perfect. Blame Castro. Light the match. Let the world burn. But something went wrong. The cops didn't show. Oswald was arrested. Ferrie never made it to the airstrip. He stayed behind, and in that moment, he must have known. The kid he'd mentored, the boy he'd groomed from a young age, was about to be erased. Just another expendable piece in a deadly game of chess. And that's when Ferrie made his move. He slipped out of New Orleans and headed straight for Houston, checking into a roadside motel quietly owned by none other than Carlos Marcello. Panic had set in. He began calling Jack Ruby. The message was clear. You messed up. And if you want to live, if you want to keep your sister and your brother breathing, then you're going to do what's necessary. Jack Ruby had made mistakes before. Big ones. There were whispers that when Carlos Marcello was deported to Guatemala, Ruby had siphoned off a little too much from the skim, the cash he was supposed to be sending up the pipeline to New Orleans. Maybe he thought no one would notice. But Marcello had eyes everywhere. Ruby was one of the most important bagmen in Texas, especially when it came to moving money from Cuba into the hands of the Chicago outfit and the New Orleans syndicate. But Ruby got greedy. And when Marcello returned, he found out everything. He knew Ruby's sister was knee-deep in the racket. He knew his brother was tied in too. And in the world of organized crime, once you're owned by the Mafia, you're owned. Not just metaphorically. You belonged to them. Every breath, every move, every dime. And when they called, you answered. Especially if you loved your family, and Ruby did. So Ruby did what he had to do. He walked into that police station, pulled his revolver, and fired a single shot into Oswald's gut. Right on camera. That same day, Captain Will Fritz, one of the last honest interrogators left in Dallas, sat stunned. He had been working Oswald slowly, building trust. He knew the boy was fragile, but reachable. He believed Oswald might have cracked, not out of fear, but out of rage. Oswald was already saying, "I'm just a patsy." Fritz saw the cracks forming, and then Ruby sealed them shut. The confession died with Oswald. Jean de Mohrenschildt, one of the few people who knew Oswald and his Russian wife Marina personally, once said, he might not have become involved in the assassination if people had been kinder to him. Fritz echoed that. In his notes, later buried in the Warren report, he wrote, "I might have gotten a confession if I could have just talked to him alone." But that never happened. The same could be said for David Ferrie. He knew. He knew exactly what had happened. And worse, he knew what he'd done. He had betrayed someone who trusted him with everything. A boy he had taken under his wing back in the 1950s, a lonely boy whose mother did not care too much about what happened to him. A kid desperate for purpose, now reduced to a national disgrace with 2 children left fatherless. Ferrie knew Lee Harvey Oswald was deluded, misguided, and tragically alone, and that the last man he ever trusted had turned him into a Louisiana-style patsy. And now that kid was dead. Ferrie's conscience wasn't just whispering, it was screaming. The paranoia festered. Any mention of the Kennedy assassination sent him into fits, nervous, sweaty, twitchy. The Warren report didn't calm him. It made it worse, because the whole thing didn't stack up, not to him, not to anyone who really knew what went down. And Ferrie, with his trail of unspoken nights and closed-door conversations, was sure someone would talk. Someone who had been in those bedrooms. So he lied. When the Secret Service came knocking, Ferrie told them he never even knew Oswald. He claimed he'd been roller skating in Houston that weekend, that his plane was grounded, that everything was normal. But the lies couldn't hide what the Warren Commission ignored. David Ferrie's name never appeared in the index. Neither did Carlos Marcello. Not once. 888 pages, and not a single mention of the mob boss Robert Kennedy had once deported, interrogated, and labeled the #1 threat to the nation. But the truth? It was right there, in plain sight. Oswald had joined the Civil Air Patrol in 1955. Ferrie was his commanding officer. A photograph eventually surfaced. A cookout, Ferrie grinning, Oswald lurking in the background, alone, like a ghost. In 1978, the House Select Committee on Assassinations found 5 separate eyewitnesses confirming that Ferrie and Oswald not only knew each other, they spent time together. A lot of time. By then, Edward Vobel, Oswald's childhood friend, was already dead. But his interviews, ignored by the Warren Commission, told a different story. One about a lonely kid drawn into a world he barely understood by a man who made him feel seen. Ferrie was the recruiter. Marcello was the puppet master. Oswald was the tool, and Jack Ruby, he was the cleaner, the man who made the last problem disappear. It was rushed, it was reckless, and it was pure mob logic. Dallas was never meant to be a symbolic city. It was a death sentence. Carlos Marcello, cold, calculating, and utterly convinced, was one of the first mob bosses to handpick Dallas as the perfect stage for the hit on President John F. Kennedy. He made it sound like scripture when he spoke about it to a trusted associate. You don't cut off the tail of a dog, you cut its throat. No more warnings. No more intimidation. The Kennedys had pushed too far, and this was the response. Santo Traficante was of the same mind. Sitting in a Miami apartment one night with Cuban exile Jose Aleman, Traficante tried to talk business, Teamster loans, real estate, Hoffa's headaches. But the conversation turned dark. Traficante was agitated, furious even. He won't be re-elected, he said of Kennedy. He's going to be hit. Aleman thought he meant political votes, polls, that kind of hit. Traficante corrected him. He meant it literally. The room went cold. Traficante had sat in that chair, arms folded, voice low, and flatly predicted the president's murder in Dallas. Aleman didn't interrupt. Macho Jenner was leaving the room. Nobregas looked away. They all knew better than to ask questions when Santo Traficante spoke in absolutes, and yet it wasn't just idle talk. John Martino, another associate close to both Traficante and Marcello, told his own son days before the assassination. If Kennedy ever goes to Dallas, he'll be hit. And he wasn't just making dinner conversation. Martino, in the aftermath, would be the one spreading rumors to reporters, pushing Oswald's supposed links to Castro, to Cuba, to the Soviet embassy. It was misdirection, smokescreen. The game had already started. Kennedy's trip to Dallas had been publicized. Too publicized. The motorcade route was printed in newspapers. It was fate. Pure and brutal fate that tethered the destiny of the Kennedy family to Carlos Marcello. 2 powerful bloodlines on a collision course. One born into political royalty, the other carved from the swamps of Louisiana, ruling his kingdom with cash, silence, and fear. And in a strange twist of poetic symmetry, they both married Jacqueline. Carlos Marcello's wife bore the name long before Jackie Kennedy made it iconic. But this wasn't about women. It was about legacy. 2 men standing on opposite ends of America's shadow, their stories entangled long before the first shot was fired in Daley Plaza. 4 possible motorcade routes were under discussion. The mob knew them all, and the one that was ultimately selected. That was Sergeant Patrick Dean's contribution. Maybe he was bribed. Maybe he talked too much. But either way, someone got the final route to Oswald. Oswald was seen at a payphone. The weather was clear. The bubble top was off. He got the signal. He climbed to the 6th floor. Then came the shots. Oswald fled. Hours later, staring into television cameras, he declared himself a patsy. He wasn't sweaty. He wasn't wild-eyed. He looked calm, like a man who expected someone to get him out. But once reporters started asking about his Cuban ties, his Russian wife, and his visits to the embassies in Mexico City, he knew. He wasn't getting out. The cleanup began immediately. Marcello, meanwhile, was watching it all unfold like a chess player studying the board. For years, he kept tabs on every article, every report, every whisper. In the 1970s, FBI wiretaps picked up Marcello's conversations with the Campisi crime family. He still read every headline that mentioned Kennedy and the mob. Local papers were intercepted and hand-delivered to him before the national press even got wind. But his fatal flaw wasn't his crime. It was his ego. He couldn't let it go. He couldn't stay quiet. Robert Kennedy didn't let it go either. Even while the Warren Commission marched to its own conclusions, Bobby ran his own silent investigation. He hired private investigator Walter Sheridan to dig deep into Oswald, Ruby and Carlos Marcello, and Sheridan wasn't the only one chasing ghosts. Edgar Hoover opened his own backdoor inquiry. 12 days of interviews, informants, and pressure. Word got back that Oswald had been seen collecting an envelope of cash in New Orleans just days before the assassination. The man who handed it to him? Marcello's own brother. Hoover was stunned. He exploded in fury. He fired every FBI agent in New Orleans. Aaron Cohen, an agent who had been warning about Marcello for a decade, was pulled out of the shadows and made Hoover's personal point man for organized crime in Louisiana. Marcello had expected the heat to cool down after Kennedy's death. It got hotter. Every politician in New Orleans with ties to Marcello came under federal investigation. His safety net was ripped away, and while federal pressure mounted, a quiet storm brewed inside his own crime family. Silver Dollar Sam, Anthony Carolla, returned from Sicily. Some said it was for medical treatment. Others said his own children brought him back to force Marcello out. They'd figured out the truth, or at least suspected it, and if they could figure it out, so could the feds. Carolla had the backing of the Trafficante family. Marcello was cornered. But this was no ordinary boss. He was one of the most sophisticated mob leaders in American history. He still had powerful friends. Carlo Gambino, Tommy Lucchese, the Genovese family, the Colombo family. When Lucchese fell ill with a brain tumor, a new boss had to be chosen. A meeting was called. The votes were rigged. But what took place at that meeting would become legend, dubbed Little Appalachian. When Marcello returned to New Orleans, the message was clear. He was still boss. But the noose kept tightening. He punched a federal agent. That led to another indictment. More scrutiny, more trials. He was watching the world close in, and then politics turned against him again. Robert Kennedy was back, not just as a senator. He had his eyes on the White House, and with Martin Luther King Jr. they formed an alliance. The path was clear. Marcello knew the CIA feared Kennedy's return. So did the outfit. He had to move fast. He turned to an old ally, Jim Garrison. Garrison, under federal investigation himself, was summoned. Marcello didn't make polite requests. He gave orders. At the snap of a finger, Garrison reopened the Kennedy case. Quiet at first. Then, in March 1967, it exploded. The newspapers named one man, David Ferrie, and when Carlos Marcello saw that name in print, he knew the storm had finally arrived. It was never really about justice. It was about survival. In early 1967, Jim Garrison, district attorney of Orleans Parish, was facing pressure from every direction. The FBI was sniffing around his office. Whispers were growing about his deepening ties to the underworld, particularly his quiet dependency on one man, Carlos Marcello, the undisputed king of Louisiana's criminal empire. Garrison's home, it turned out, was owned by a captain in Marcello's syndicate, and when Garrison needed a witness, someone who could tie the CIA into a plot to kill the president, it was Marcello who delivered him one, David Ferrie. Ferrie was fragile, bald from illness, erratic from years of paranoia, and crushed by a conscience that had finally begun to crack. He knew Oswald. He had known him since the kid was 16, back when Ferrie was a civil air patrol commander, and he had handed Oswald over, fed him into the machine, believing, perhaps naively, that the boy might make it out alive. He was wrong. Now, with the heat turning up and Garrison preparing for a press conference, Ferrie was spiraling. The pressure was unbearable. He knew what was coming. He'd seen how Marcello dealt with loose ends. On February 22nd, 1967, David Ferrie was found dead in his apartment. 2 typewritten suicide notes lay beside him. But something was off. His body showed no signs of violence, no overdose, no trauma, just death, clean and efficient. Coroner Dr. Nicholas Chetter called it a cerebral hemorrhage, but in New Orleans, coroners like Chetter had long been accused of being on the take. No one believed it was natural. The night before, Garrison had announced Ferrie was going to be indicted in the assassination of President John Kennedy. Then, Ferrie dropped dead. Coincidence? Nobody bought it. The whisper started again. Carlos Marcello had silenced him, and Ferrie wasn't the only one to go quiet. Within 24 hours of David Ferrie's mysterious death, another body dropped. This time, it was Eladio del Valle, Ferrie's old associate, a former Cuban congressman under Batista, and the self-proclaimed first anti-Castro exile in America. He was found in a red Cadillac parked in a shopping plaza in Miami. His skull was split wide open. A bullet was buried in his heart. A patrolman stumbled across the scene, unsure of what he was looking at. A botched hit, a message. The police were baffled. Officially, they blamed questionable circles and vague ties to pre-Castro Havana. But those who knew Ferrie, those who understood the stakes, they knew. Del Valle had been close, too close. He knew about Ferrie, about Cuba, about the past and the present, about Oswald. Now he was silent. And it didn't stop there. 3 months later, another of Ferrie's confidants, Dr. Mary Sherman, was found murdered in her New Orleans apartment. A renowned cancer specialist, respected around the world, and head of orthopedic surgery at the Oxnard Clinic, she was supposed to be above suspicion, above danger. But no one was safe now. Her body was found stabbed 8 times. Her apartment had been set ablaze. Firefighters forced their way inside after neighbors reported smoke. What they found wasn't just shocking, it was surgical. There were no signs of forced entry. Her car was discovered abandoned 9 blocks away. Police theorized she knew her killer, that whoever walked through her door did so with ease, maybe even with a smile. But once inside, they didn't hesitate. Mary Sherman wasn't just Ferrie's friend. She was his mirror, his confidant, the one who knew what he had done and what he feared. And like Eladio del Valle, she was now gone. 2 murders, both brutal, both targeted. Both were tied to David Ferrie. The bodies were piling up, and the truth was being buried alongside them. If you included Oswald, that made 3 people with direct ties to Ferrie, who were all dead within years of each other. Meanwhile, Garrison pushed forward. He publicly blamed the CIA for Kennedy's murder, drawing a big red circle around Clay Shaw, a respected New Orleans businessman with past ties to the agency. But the real question was, why? Why now? Because Garrison owed Marcello. Marcello had given him campaign support, political favors, even a subsidized house in the suburbs. Garrison returned the favor by turning a blind eye to Marcello's criminal empire, dismissing the idea that organized crime even existed in New Orleans. But now Marcello needed a diversion. The CIA made a perfect villain, and the timing. Impeccable. Robert F. Kennedy was preparing for a run at the presidency, and this investigation, this circus, served as a warning shot. If Bobby came after Marcello again, they would smear him with his brother's blood. The message couldn't have been clearer. The FBI was watching Hoover's files exploded with movement. He scrambled agents, issued directives, and tried, unsuccessfully, to discredit Garrison. But the genie was already out of the bottle. Allegations flooded in. One FBI informant spoke about Marcello and of his ties to Jack Ruby through another link, which involved the Bourbon Street clubs, and a stripper named Jada, who had danced both at Pete Marcello's show bar and Ruby's Carousel Club in Dallas. Meanwhile, Edward Becker, a New Orleans businessman, fingered Marcello directly. He told FBI agents that Marcello had ranted about Kennedy's war on the Mafia, screaming in a fit of rage, "Get rid of that little son of a bitch." Yet, even Becker's account was suppressed. Hoover tried to get his testimony pulled from a book. I tried to erase it. Too late. By the summer of 1967, Hoover's dam was cracking. The media was finally waking up. Books were flying off the shelves. Mark Lane's Rush to Judgment, Josiah Thompson's 6 Seconds in Dallas, Sylvia Meagher's Accessories After the Fact. For the first time, the American public wasn't buying the lone nut narrative. They were asking questions, and some of the answers led back to Carlos Marcello. But Jim Garrison? He kept the spotlight away from the Mafia. He zeroed in on the CIA, pushed Clay Shaw to trial, and kept the media circus spinning. Privately, Garrison may have believed what he was saying. Publicly, he was a pawn, a tool, and Marcello. He wasn't done playing. In June 1967, a campaign was launched to destroy Edward Partin, the key witness who had helped put Jimmy Hoffa in prison. Hoffa's allies, including Marcello and his fixer D'Alton Smith, offered Partin $1 million to recant. He refused. So they did the next best thing. They used Garrison's investigation to paint Partin as part of the Kennedy plot. Radio stations in Baton Rouge picked up the story. Garrison, willingly or not, had become an accomplice in a campaign to discredit the one man who could keep Hoffa behind bars. Hoover had seen a lot in his long reign atop the Bureau, but nothing prepared him for the storm Jim Garrison was brewing in New Orleans. Hoover wasn't just surprised. He was stunned. For the first time, he saw the full scale of Carlos Marcello's empire, how deep it ran, how far it stretched, and just how insulated it was. The secrets Marcello held could crack open Washington like a melon, and Hoover, for once, realized the Bureau was outmatched. For years, Hoover treated New Orleans like a punishment post. Agents who embarrassed him or questioned his authority were quietly reassigned to Louisiana, a place he believed would break their spirits, with its unbearable heat, sweltering humidity, and political chaos. But Hoover had underestimated the Crescent City. Its jazz clubs, vibrant street life, the cuisine, and easy charm did the opposite. These agents fell in love with New Orleans, and worse, they started to get comfortable with their underworld. By the time the 1960s rolled around, Hoover's Southern problem had become an embarrassment. His own agents, men handpicked to fade into bureaucratic obscurity, were now wining and dining with Marcello's lieutenants. Some were building social capital by cozying up to Marcello himself, and Hoover, who had spent decades denying the existence of organized crime altogether, had walked himself into a trap. These were the same men he would later tell, "Back off, Marcello. We're not here to prod, we're here to gather." Carlos Marcello wasn't just a crime boss, he was a kingmaker. He had political allies across the South, powerful lawyers in D.C., and a velvet rope into the back rooms of power. Even men in Hoover's orbit, like Washington fixer Irving Davidson and attorney Jack Wasserman, were known to share a drink with the very crime figures Hoover had just realized were a threat. After the Kennedy assassination, Hoover attempted a quiet course correction. He initiated an internal shakeup of the FBI's New Orleans office. He promoted Aaron Cohn, a longtime investigator who had been warning about Marcello for years and was largely ignored, to become his personal liaison on New Orleans criminal affairs. But the move was too little, too late. What Marcello was running down there wasn't just a racket. It was a government of its own, and the backlash came fast. Some of the Bureau's own men, furious at Hoover's inaction and loyal to the legacy of Robert Kennedy, left the FBI entirely. They went straight into the arms of sympathetic publications, outlets like Life magazine, which still carried a torch for the fallen Kennedy brothers. These men brought evidence, stories, and raw disgust, and what followed was open warfare in print. In September 1967, Life magazine launched a blistering exposé. They ran pieces on the Las Vegas Skim, on Edward Partin, and on Carlos Marcello's grip over Louisiana politics. They revealed that Marcello had been entrusted with $2 million to help get Jimmy Hoffa out of prison. And in the middle of it all, they mentioned Jim Garrison, who was still insisting publicly that organized crime did not exist in New Orleans. 1 week later, Life followed up with a surgical strike. The September 8th issue dismantled Garrison's credibility, exposing his political ties to Marcello's associates and shining a spotlight on the district attorney's questionable alliances. Garrison was humiliated, and the war was no longer hidden. Marcello responded the only way he knew how, with pressure. He sent his lawyers and political enforcers straight to the offices of Life magazine, threatening lawsuits and demanding retractions. But the magazine didn't blink. They had more. Much more. Photographs, documents, testimony. Life had a kill shot's worth of dirt on Carlos Marcello, his criminal syndicate, and the rotting foundation of Louisiana's political structure, and even after the storm of March 1967, after Life magazine cracked him open and exposed his ties like a gutted fish, Jim Garrison refused to quit. His investigations didn't stall. They escalated. It became a personal crusade. He wasn't just chasing shadows. He was trying to embarrass Hoover, to humiliate the man who had built his career denying the Mafia even existed. And the truth was, it wasn't hard. Garrison's own financial dealings hinted at something murky. On a public salary of $17,500 a year, he managed to purchase a handsome upper-middle-class home at 4600 Owens Boulevard. The property had been built by Frank Occhipinti, a man with well-documented business ties to Carlos Marcello, the undisputed boss of the New Orleans Mafia. Occhipinti, along with Peter Cassano, the seller of the home and also connected to the Occhipinti law firm, was enmeshed in real estate ventures and development deals with the Marcello family. Marcello and his brothers, together with the Occhipintis, had long been involved in lucrative enterprises, including the Town and Country Motel along the airline highway, a property that, even after it was sold, remained under their control. As of 1968, Carlos Marcello's name still appeared in the Jefferson Parish tax records for the motel, a known headquarters for other Mafia-connected ventures like Southern Tours Incorporated, which operated sightseeing buses in partnership with Marcello's brother Anthony and Basil Ingracia. Despite this evidence, Garrison publicly referred to Carlos Marcello as a respectable businessman during a taped NBC interview. Law enforcement officers familiar with Marcello's operations reportedly laughed out loud at the statement. This was a man, after all, whom the Immigration and Naturalization Service had been attempting to deport for years. Even more damning, Garrison had once accepted hospitality indirectly from the mob boss. His expenses during a Las Vegas trip in 1967 were covered by Mario Marino, a former Marcello flunky and known button man. Marino, when summoned for questioning by investigators, was picked up at the airport by Marcello's brother Joseph and whisked away to Marcello's estate in Covington, Louisiana. The FBI, tailing the group, documented the entire rendezvous. Then there was David Ferrie, one of Garrison's original suspects in the alleged JFK conspiracy. Ferrie was more than just a bizarre and volatile presence. He had long-standing ties to Marcello. He had worked as an investigator for Ray Gill, Marcello's personal attorney, and had been in regular contact with Marcello. There were even whispers that Ferrie had piloted the plane that brought Marcello back from Guatemala following a forced deportation. Yet Garrison, armed with subpoenas, a national platform, and the full resources of a district attorney's office, chose not to investigate the one man with the motive, means, and muscle to orchestrate a hit on President John Kennedy. Carlos Marcello, whose empire stretched from the French Quarter to the corridors of political power, was virtually untouched. Instead, Garrison focused on Clay Shaw, a respected businessman and private citizen with no ties to organized crime. Garrison's case against Shaw, concocted on the flimsiest of premises and bolstered by hypnotized witnesses and fabricated stories, ultimately collapsed. Still, Garrison pressed forward, charging Shaw with perjury in a desperate bid to sustain the illusion of legitimacy. It wasn't just delusion. There were whispers of vendettas and financial motives. Garrison maintained a secret fund, JGSAFI, or Jim Garrison's Special Aid for Investigation, which he used as he saw fit, sometimes mixing private and personal expenses. Former aides, like Tom Bethel and William Gurvich, quit in disgust and were later indicted or charged for supposed theft of office records, a tactic that reeked more of retaliation than justice. The Internal Revenue Service eventually took notice. 2 special agents were sent to New Orleans to investigate Garrison's finances and associations. There was a pretty strong smell, one former IRS official remarked, referring to Garrison's close proximity to men who can operate only if they know the right people. The investigation was active and ongoing at the time the source left the agency. Garrison, naturally, claimed it was all part of a federal vendetta. But the most damning fact of all remained this. Garrison, the self-styled slayer of conspiracies, had every reason and every opportunity to look into the Mafia's potential involvement in President Kennedy's assassination. Particularly the involvement of Carlos Marcello, who had a direct motive in Attorney General Robert Kennedy's aggressive anti-racketeering campaign. Instead, Garrison looked the other way. He aimed his fire at the dead, the marginalized, and the politically expendable. In doing so, he protected the powerful, whether by design or convenience, and became, in the eyes of many, not the man who exposed the truth, but the man who helped bury it. There were boxes of files, whispers in strip clubs, old court records, and loose-lipped men with long memories. Strippers spoke of Oswald, dancers recalled Ruby, comedians, waitresses, even low-level hoods all talked about David Ferrie and the quiet little introductions he made, like the time he brought Oswald into Ruby's club and told everyone they were both CIA. Garrison knew Ferrie had once stood in court with Carlos Marcello, shoulder to shoulder with Guy Bannister. There were photographs, witnesses, court records, trails, and every trail he followed took him back to the same names: Carlos Marcello, Santo Traficante, Hoffa. But the deeper Garrison went, the more he was being played. Used. He became a pawn in a far bigger game, a walking diversion. Hoffa's people were feeding him breadcrumbs. Marcello's men were helping him stir the pot. Each tip pushed him closer to the CIA and further away from the mob. That was the plan. Distract, deflect, delay, and Garrison delivered perfectly. By the time Clay Shaw was acquitted, Garrison's reputation had been obliterated. His courtroom had turned into a circus. He paraded theories so bizarre they collapsed under their own weight. One of them: that President Kennedy was killed as part of a gay conspiracy involving Clay Shaw, David Ferrie, and Jack Ruby. Because Kennedy, in Garrison's mind, was just too handsome for them to resist. It sounded insane. It was insane. But it was also on record. I've already covered that absurd theory in one of my earlier documentaries, using direct press quotes, word for word as they came out. Because history isn't always clean. Sometimes it's chaotic. And sometimes the only way to find the truth is to dig through the debris, article by article, statement by statement, until the voices from the past speak louder than the spin. By 1969, it was over. In March of that year, Clay Shaw walked free. The jury took less than an hour, 55 minutes, to reach a decision. One of Shaw's first interviews afterward was with a journalist from Look magazine, someone he trusted. He didn't gloat. He didn't shout. He just told his side of the story. Garrison's case? In ruins. But even in disgrace, Jim Garrison had served a purpose. He didn't crack the case. He clouded it. He muddied the waters. He bought Carlos Marcello the one thing every gangster prays for: time. It would take another 11 years, until the House Select Committee on Assassinations reopened the case, for organized crime to be officially named as a likely conspirator in the Kennedy assassination. But by then, the game had changed. Witnesses were dead. Records were gone. The trail had been doused in gasoline and set on fire. Jim Garrison wanted to make history. Instead, he bought it, and the cost was truth. By 1969, Carlos Marcello was untouchable. He stood in the shadows of Louisiana's swamps and smiled, because he knew something that Washington didn't. While Garrison was chasing ghosts, Marcello had gone to war again. The year was 1968, and the boss was sharpening his blade. His world was shifting right before his eyes. The old control was slipping. Carlos Marcello, once the undisputed king of Southern corruption, was watching the very machine he built begin to break down. He had lived off buying elections, controlling unions, fixing judges, and stacking the vote. But in 1968, everything began to tilt. Martin Luther King Jr. was organizing the black vote with terrifying efficiency across the South. The civil rights movement had awakened not just New York, Chicago, and California, but Mississippi, Arkansas, and Marcello's own backyard of Louisiana. The old Dixiecrats, the Southern Democrats who built their kingdoms on segregation and suppression, could feel their grip slipping. And the death of John Kennedy had only accelerated the change. So, they turned to an old playbook, one written in the British Empire's colonial blood: divide and conquer. It didn't matter if it was race, religion, education, or geography. Southern elites and crooked politicians across the country, from Chicago to California, saw what was coming, and they panicked. Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, segregationists in tailored suits. Their answer wasn't unity, it was manipulation. They weaponized division to maintain power. They teamed up with gangsters, spooks, and corporate barons. They turned the American dream into a battlefield, using propaganda perfected by the Nazis and stolen through Operation Paperclip. The CIA took notes. They took scientists, and they took control. Universities stopped being centers of thought and became factories for war. Scientific breakthroughs, medical advancements, even space travel, none of it benefited the people footing the bill. American taxpayers were financing their own oppression, feeding a political class more powerful than any monarchy, and building a military-industrial complex that didn't just dominate global warfare, it dominated the soul of the nation, and standing against all of it were two men, Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy. If Bobby Kennedy got back into the White House, Marcello knew it was over. This wasn't the naive young brother from 1961 anymore. This was a man who had picked Marcello up from New Orleans and dumped him in Guatemala. If he came back to power, he'd finish the job. Marcello had thought the bullet that killed John Kennedy would end it. Cut the head off, and the body dies. But Bobby Kennedy was a ghost that wouldn't leave, a relentless hunter, the tail that wouldn't stop twitching. Now Bobby had to go too. In 1968, they did it again. First, they took out Martin Luther King Jr., the man who dared to unify the poor, black and white. Then, weeks later, they shot Robert Kennedy dead in a Los Angeles kitchen pantry. Two voices silenced. Two threats were neutralized. The 1960s became a decade of assassinations, not just of men, but of ideas. Anyone who stood in the way of secrecy, of corruption, of the shadow state, was eliminated. Hoover had always claimed communism was the enemy, but after the Kennedys, he changed his tune. He told his men to forget the Reds. Now they were going after organized crime. Too little, too late. Because the CIA had never served the people. Since the days of the OSS, they had made their alliances not with Congress or the Constitution, but with the underworld. In Italy, naval intelligence officers worked hand in glove with the Genovese family to smuggle heroin under the pretense of fighting the Soviets. The same dope that poured through France and into Harlem came in through Louisiana. That trafficking network was an intelligence operation, one that continued even after Vito Genovese went to prison. These men weren't just running drugs. They were funding black operations, controlling elections, and infiltrating governments. The IRS never tried to take over the White House. Neither did the FBI, but the CIA. They had been trying to install one of their own since the days of Tom Dewey, and they finally did it through Truman and later Nixon. It was under Eisenhower and Allen Dulles that the CIA reached its golden age. But all of it, everything they built, came crashing down under John Kennedy. That's why I started this channel. To tell the stories no one else would. To shine a light not just on the Mafia as we know it, but on the Southern underworld. On the Marcello machine. On the history they buried. This isn't just a story about New Orleans or Dallas. It's a story about America, about power, about truth, and about the ghosts that never stopped haunting the men who thought they could get away with murder. I'll end this chapter here, but the story continues. Because when I begin the documentary on Carlos Marcello, we're going all the way.